Can we get...
But I'm genuinely optimistic about work in the metaverse. Whether as a hologram sitting next to you in a physical meeting or in a discussion taking place in the metaverse.
I think this technology is inevitable. I think this is the future of the internet. So I think over time you will see greater and greater acceptance.
We believe that AI will be about individual empowerment and agency at a scale that we've never seen before. And that will elevate humanity to a scale that we've never seen before either.
We'll be able to create a theory of the entire universe.
A Tesla car next year will probably be 90%.
That's 2014.
Autopilot.
I'm extremely confident of achieving full autonomy and releasing it to the Tesla customer base next year.
Everything is possible. Everything is happening tomorrow like a font of optimism. Yeah. If you go to a climate conference, it's different, and for good reason. We can go ahead on this, Bruno. I want to show you a word cloud from a recent climate conference I went to. Supply chain problems, inflation, NIMBYism, et cetera. Essentially, there's almost a paradox of pessimism, and that's well earned. But every once in a while, I find myself saying, I want to just channel my inner tech for a second and like, what could go right? And let me share just a few things that are out there. First of all, I think we have to assume discontinuities. If you look at most of the climate work that's done, it's over 30 years, essentially assuming, and this is, by the way, I'm sorry, if you go back one, please. If you go back to what SBTI just put out for the path to net zero, I want to read this to you, Jason, for a moment. So this is what business is supposed to do. The minimum forward-looking ambition of near-term targets consistent with reaching net zero by 2050 at the latest, assuming a linear absolute reduction, linear intensity reduction, and intensity convergence between the most recent year and not increasing absolute emissions or intensity.
I mean, that makes total sense to me, right?
Now, first of all, there's great science behind that. I admire it. But imagine trying to figure out the iPhone in 1982 based on a computing graph. One thing I know from 40 years in business is nothing is linear, and there will be surprises. In fact, we should assume that there's going to be discontinuity. More people died from infections than heart attacks before penicillin. You know, taxis were taxis before Uber. Trading was trading until indexing. So industries constantly go through disruptions. As I travel the client world, I'm running into disruptions that are about to happen at any time. I can't yet tell you which will happen, but I would bet on the field. There are going to be discontinuities that break our way. Our goal is to position for them. The second thing I'd point out on the green shoot side is understand the power of cost curves. Think about cell phones. In about 2000, they hit a whole new level, and suddenly they were ubiquitous. It changed how video conferencing came out in 1964, but it was $5,300 an hour. When it's free, things work very differently. In the climate world, you are watching some of the most powerful industrial cost curves I've ever seen. 28% for solar, that is double a normal industry. And these cost curves, while they look linear, they hit points, like right about now when solar becomes dramatically cheaper, things happen. We can predict the cost curves, we can't predict how the market changes.
So then why that word cloud of pessimism?
Well, I think in some ways, the voices that got us to this key moment have been calling out the need. And part of the reason I'm on the stage, I don't do many conferences, is we need to change our voices a little. We need to also make sure that we're looking for that opportunity. And we're looking for Colin Powell once said about leadership is that optimism is a force multiplier. We have to find a little bit of optimism. That is not to deny that this is tough. And the last thing on optimism is, you know, when things like this conference happen where you get many parts of society, policy members, activists working together, things happen.
Yeah.
Anyone remember the population bomb? 30 printings back in 1968. We were going to be out of food. Los Angeles, the smog was awful. I was in Beijing 3 weeks ago. The skies were clear. The ozone layer is actually going the other way now. Now, with time and with action, I think we can make progress. And that green shoots are something we need to grab a hold of.
All right, so I'm going to go counter then for my next for my next question, which is the whataboutisms.
Yeah, we also, as well as some optimism, we have to basically not fall for whataboutism.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the interesting things that's happened, if you look online and at social media, the attacks of climate deniers have flattened, but the attacks on climate solutions have gone up. And these are whataboutisms. Now, whataboutisms is a term that came from the 70s with the Irish Republican Army. Whenever they would do something, they'd say, what about the British soldiers? And Soviet propaganda uses whataboutisms. When Chernobyl hits, it's what about 3 Mile Island? And whataboutisms have hit now an absolute art form in today's politics. Let me just kind of show you what that sounds like.
What about those 21 Democrats?
What about beans that have more oil?
What about the Buddhists? What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? What about us?
What about me? What about terrorism?
But what about Benghazi? What about the blatant lies that the Obama administration told us? What about the fact that Ben Rhodes bragged about lying to the media and the public about the Iran deal?
Whenever a pundit or a politician starts with what about, be prepared to be deflected and potentially deceived. So whatabouts are rampant in climate. Like, what about EVs?
Right.
Aren't they dirtier? Well, yes, when it leaves a factory, because you have the battery in it, it's slightly more emissions at manufacture. But once it gets on the road, an EV is 90% more efficient and uses 1/3 of the emissions over its lifetime. It's a ridiculous argument. Or what about solar panels in China? Yes, they take some of the power from a grid that is still dirty and they generate emissions. But if you look at the numbers, those emissions are replaced in 3 months of their 25-year life. Are we not supposed to use solar panels because we're trying to replace a grid that's dirty? We can never replace it if we don't start using them. It's a circular argument. Or one of my favorites is basically the pessimism and whataboutism with materials. Yes, we have a lot of work to do. We can find oil in the North Sea. We can't find lithium. Like, if you look at what happened in lithium, we went from worried we'd never have enough lithium to a massive oversupply in 2 years. So my point here is, as we're going down this path, we have to make sure that we don't get caught in the whataboutisms. And I always say, like, you know, what about doing the work?
Yeah.
What about solving the problem?
And so how do you institutionalize, or how do you sort of create, I mean, because part of this is perception, part of this is the dialogue, part of this, you know, we saw a lot of cable news clips, and between cable news and social media, it picks up a lot of steam. So what can a group like this of the what about we do the work folks do?
It's exactly that. I think one of the things I've learned in climate, and to your earlier question of why I've gone deep, is you cannot be a tourist in climate. You can't just sort of pop in and think you know the answer. This is an immensely complicated revolution that we're going through. I don't think I have to tell this room because you're here, but we have to encourage people to do the work and not simply fall back on how things are done now.
Right.
Just as an aside here, you have to understand what we're doing is a simplification problem. I want you to think about our current energy system. You want to turn on a light. How does that work? Well, first of all, 50 million years ago, the sun shines. It's captured in a tree. The tree falls down. For 50 million years, it gets subsumed under thousands of feet. We then take an iron pipe. We put it down 10,000 feet. We turn it right. We put in water. We crack rock. We bring up a vapor. The vapor goes in 3 million miles of pipe. We wash it in a $250 million natural gas processing plant. We put it in 3 million miles of pipe again. We put it to $1 billion gas turbine. We basically blow it up, releasing a molecule that can destroy the world, and we have an electron. The other way to do that is we can get sun from this afternoon, hit a silicon panel. There's silicon everywhere, and we have an electron.
Yeah.
So it seems hard to do. I mean, this is hard to do, but what we're doing is hard.
Yeah.
So, like, why not make it a little more simple?
All right. So that takes me to the third one that I wanted to touch on with you, which is the policy box, because this is a room of doers, as you mentioned. It's not totally simple how we get this done, and it requires a bunch of different angles. So tell us about the policy side.
Yeah, I think we have had an enormous gift, and we picked up an enormous set of allies in the recent policy wave. And I'm often asked, like, are you nervous investing in areas that have subsidies? I'm nervous investing in food I mean, there's 400 million of subsidies in European food. Healthcare, like that's subsidized. And if you think about the IRA, it's about $76 billion a year. We are subsidizing fossil fuels around the world at close to $700 billion a year. So it's not just about subsidies, it's are they settled and has it become part of the landscape in a way we can count on? And, it's staggering what's happened in the last 4 years. If you look at it, the U.S. in three bills, it's close to $600 billion. If you go to Europe, they've pledged $1.6 trillion. You can never really tell in Europe where the dollars are there, but it's been pledged. China, the only part of investment that grew in China last year is green sector of their economy. And, it's not just there. It's India, which is all in, Australia. Australia has a Green New Deal, and I could go on and on around the world. Kenya, Malaysia, the world has decided, much like healthcare, much like education, that this is an area that needs to be subsidized. But what's important is actually not the numbers, and this has been a light going off for me. It's the shape. So the original policy dilemma was a balance beam, affordability and sustainability. And as I showed you, the affordability is getting better. But what happened is we've now changed the shape of policy. With the Ukraine, suddenly Europe and around the world realized that they could not count on the current system for energy security. If you want energy security and you don't have oil and gas, you got to go green. Right. So suddenly, green had a new ally, which was security. And then a fourth ally picked up, because if you look at the IRA, probably the key part of it, and the reason Macron was so mad at us, was there was a industrial policy to it, a reindustrialization of the country. 270,000 jobs in the U.S., millions of jobs in China. They figured out in China that for every job that they lose in the fossil fuel industry, they pick up 4.5 in the green. So suddenly, this debate that many of us in the room have been rooting for, the environmentalists, the activists, got new allies, and those new allies are called energy security and jobs. Right. And those allies are showing up in weird places. One of the reasons that I'm maybe less worried about policy right now changing with an administration is the money has gone to the red states. The blue states voted for it. The money has gone to the red states. And so your new set of allies looks like this.
In the heart of Texas, green jobs are booming.
But increasingly, Wyoming's energy comes not from mining what's down below, but from mining the wind above.
Different kind of farm in Crittenden County is planting the seeds to grow jobs and produce green energy.
Texas is seeing a boom in renewable energy, and that means more companies are hiring.
The governors of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana announced the hydrogen partnership this week.
But
essentially now, politicians are in a box. If we did away with the IRA, we do away with a lot of jobs. And are the politicians that have been cutting ribbons willing to shut the factories down?
And do you think, we're headed for, I think it's fair to say, quite an election. Do you have confidence? Do you have real confidence that a new administration, a non-democratic administration, will continue to invest here?
As my partner Hank Paulson said, if some of the things happening in politics happen here, this is maybe number 10 on my list. Yeah. So I can't have confidence about a lot of things. Right. But what I can say is these allies of jobs make a difference.
Mm. And Texas is a fascinating example of that, because clearly not a lot redder than that place. All right. We just have a couple minutes left. Let's talk about passing the baton briefly, because I feel like that's a nice sort of way to send this audience off, or send us off, I guess, and give them something to chew on.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm watching, this is important, it's an important moment, is a bit of a passing the baton of a race that we're all running together. And I think it's a very positive thing. We should celebrate it. In certain types of human endeavor, there tends to be a little bit of a relay race. This is an Olympic year or something, in relays. And it often starts with the scientists. Think about Niels Bohr, the ARPANET scientists, Mariko and Wiseman. Then it moves on to the prophets. The people tell us we need to pay attention. Einstein sends a note to FDR, says, you got to think about this bond thing. Gates talks about pandemics. It then moves to the policymakers. And finally, it moves kind of to the people who then have to get it done, the people in this room and elsewhere that have to get it done.
I do love that young, handsome Al Gore up there.
How about that, huh? He invented the internet.
Quite a callback.
He didn't invent the internet, but he helped empower it,
yeah.
right? And so this relay race happens over and over again. And if you think about what's been happening in climate, we owe so much to the scientists, Yoshino, Keeling, who's got us started, right? And then the people that have called out the need, right? We owe so much to this. The policymakers, as I just showed you, stepped up. You know, part of the reason I'm on this stage is the rest of us have to step up.
Yeah.
There's a passing of a baton that needs to happen to people. To answer your question, that's what we're trying to do.
And so, less than a minute, given everything that you've just told us, clearly you've thought about this a little bit. What does this room do? Like, what do you send them off with what's something that they can take home and say to their families, say to their partners, say to their kids about the next step that they need to take, given that you represent the money side of this?
Yeah, I think the money is going to start moving because the opportunity is there. But I think importantly, we need to take a bias to action and a touch of optimism. So one of the things that happens in a relay race is the last leg is sometimes the fastest. And what's surprised people historically is when you look at the time, I mean, after 30 years of the atomic revolution, Oppenheimer stepped in and won a war, won 7 Oscars, right? So I think there's an optimism here that we can get this moving. We may not be moving fast enough, but we are moving faster. And the path to progress and perfection starts with progress.
Right.
And I see that, I think that's happening, and the passing of the baton will accelerate it. So let's have some hope.
All right, and let's get to work. Jim Coulter, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Well, there you have it. Bloomberg Originals chief correspondent Jason Kelly sitting there with a TPG founding partner and managing partner of TPG Rise Climate, Jim Coulter, live here on the green stage at the Bloomberg Green Festival here in Seattle. Well, from the green stage to Wall Street, we're looking at quite the rotation when it comes to stocks today, out of mega cap tech stocks and into smaller companies, with the Russell 2000 having its best day of the year. It's all the result of a reset that we saw in yields, lower across the curve, following a cooler than expected inflation report. And for more, we turn now to Bloomberg economics editor Molly Smith, who joins us back at Bloomberg headquarters in New York. Molly, you take a look at EcoGo on the Bloomberg terminal, and this inflation report came in below expectations in every single category. Give us the highlights. Is this the most Fed-friendly inflation report that we've seen in quite some time?
It would definitely be hard to find another one, especially when you take this in combination with the May CPI report, which Powell this week had described as being, quote, really good. So would be curious to see how he describes this one. You know, he was pretty cautious this week in his testimony to lawmakers, saying he doesn't have the confidence yet that inflation is sustainably heading toward 2%. He said that before today's report. I'm curious now how his thinking may have changed, given that this is definitely more a signal that we're on that path. And the key here was housing. This was really finally the long-awaited slowdown we've wanted to see in shelter categories. Both, you know, some of those key indicators rising at the slowest pace since 2021, and that is such a huge weight in the overall CPI index that, you know, thankfully other categories came down as well, but that was the really big driver today.
Why is that, Molly? What's happening when it comes to housing in the U.S. where we saw prices actually cool a little bit? Or I should say inflation cool a little bit.
Right. So, I mean, it's, you know, it's so hard sometimes to talk about the housing market at a national level because it is really a very regional, zip code by zip code kind of story. But there were some outliers in the May CPI report that reversed a bit in June. So that was helpful, especially in the metro areas of New York and Boston. But generally, you know, housing inflation has just been such a stubborn category. We have this structural supply shortage of housing in the U.S., and that's not really going to go away until we get more supply coming on. We need builders to be building more homes, and you know, that's tough if the demand for housing is not there because rates and prices are so high. So we're still in a bit of a catch-22 here, that builders are trying to create more inventory, but it's just, you know, there's so much more that's needed and at much lower price points.
Our thanks to Bloomberg economics editor Molly Smith joining us from Bloomberg headquarters in New York. Now back to the green stage here in Seattle at the Bloomberg Green Festival. where we find Carol Master, my co-host. She has a discussion in progress right now on using platforms to affect change. She's joined by Sue Bird, WNBA legend, and also Kara Hurst, the Chief Sustainability Officer over at Amazon.
To be net zero carbon by 2040, that's 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. And we set that looking at the science and saying, we think we're in this decisive decade. We know we need to move faster. We have a lot of optimism about doing that, but we can't go alone. And we're excited that over 500 organizations and other companies have joined us in that. But we want to send these really strong demand signals, and we want to also put our own resources towards that. So we've been doing things like purchasing renewable energy. We're the largest corporate purchaser of renewable energy in the world. We have been for the last 4 years. We announced yesterday we've actually hit 100% renewable energy across our global operations, which is a huge feat. We have over 500 projects.
Exactly.
Around the world. We've got 24,000 electric delivery vehicles on the road already. We've got one of the world's largest electric charging infrastructure kind of operations going. We've just got, we look at all the different aspects of our operations and think about how do we make it more sustainable on behalf of our customer. We want to reduce waste. We took out those plastic air pillows. We took out 95% of those in North America. So we want to make a sustainable company and do it on behalf of our customer.
Sue, I want to bring you into it. You are part of a group of very elite athletes. And when we use the word legendary, it doesn't apply to everybody, but it definitely applies to you. So kudos. That platform, though, has been a couple of decades in the making and then some. How do you think about your platform and the responsibility of how you use it?
Yeah, women's sports is at an interesting moment, especially women's basketball. And for
a good interesting, right?
Yeah, no, great interesting, great interesting. But what's interesting about it, maybe in a negative sense, is while the coverage has increased, what I've noticed is it's not always accurate. And it's really had me take a step back and be like, first of all, what else is inaccurate out there being told to us, by trusted places, other trusted platforms. So I think for me, when it comes to my platform, for so long while I was playing, it was about, bringing a certain understanding to the game, right? Using my platform for all kinds of good. Now I'm like, wait a minute, I got to make sure the stories that are being told are accurate. I got to make sure that when people are tuning into a game, they have a full understanding. So that's really where I feel like I can use my platform now as a retired player.
It's also the way women athletes have been portrayed. Like I was reading some things about the Olympics coming up and the Olympic Committee, how they've been changing some of the standards and updating in terms of how they want media representation of women. And it's not just how they look or kind of superficial stuff, but really just what they are achieving. That's important.
So important, so important. I think what's beautiful about women, especially women's athletes, is we are dynamic. We've had to be. For so long, we weren't getting the coverage that we deserve. We weren't getting the credibility. So we had to have different parts of us. So I think it is great to highlight those things. But to your point, not just about appearance, not just about these artificial things. So I love that the Olympic Committee is doing that.
I want to talk a little bit about the climate pledge. So I'm curious, Kara, when you have conversations with companies, what is it? Is it tough to get them to sign on? Or tell us kind of the environment here.
Yeah, I think it's a huge commitment to sign on, and it certainly takes resources. And so I think it takes a leap of faith, too. Not all of us know how we're going to get there. There are some things we know how to do, like electrifying fleet, and then there are other things like aviation, where we know sustainable aviation fuel is part of it, but we don't know all of the solves. And so some of it is a bit of jumping into the fray and saying, we know some of how we're going to get there, and also we need to partner to figure out some of the other ways which we don't necessarily know. And we need to change the game, right? So we need to figure out how we're going to come together and make new decisions together, put resources together, and also public-private partnerships are a big part of it. So how do we come together and work in the cities where we all have employees or we have operations and get cities to change their infrastructure, and build differently the buildings that we're in, or put more rail in, or change our, the ways in which people commute, and those kind of things as well.
Well, Sue, was it like a no-brainer for the Storm to sign the climate pledge?
I was playing then, so I wasn't in those rooms. But
that's true.
Yes, but knowing our franchise, knowing the ownership group, I'm sure it was a no-brainer. They're very much an ownership group that wants to help the world change. I mean, it's a big statement, but at the same time, when you find the ways that you can have that impact, it's really not that big of a statement. You can really change the world.
I always think about, like, you know, we all set out on a course, whether we go to school or we start working and we think we're going to go this way and then we start going a different way. And I'm curious about, Sue, like, what motivates you and how maybe that has evolved over the years to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I'm very lucky, I say this from the start, to be an athlete. When you think back to childhood, when I think back to my childhood, I was just a kid that really liked playing. Like, I just loved playing sports, and how lucky am I that that led to an actual career where I graduate college and immediately I have a job, a profession waiting for me. So I was super lucky in that sense. But throughout my career, motivations change, right? Yeah. There's the motivation early of maybe wanting to prove yourself in a field, right? You haven't, in my world, I haven't won the championship yet. I haven't won awards yet. So I have this grit about me that I want to prove it. But then that flips when you have done it, and now you have to prove that it wasn't a fluke. And now you have to sustain, and now you have to stay, for lack of a better, on top of that mountain, which has a whole other type of challenge. And for me, as I kept doing that, then it became, okay, I've won the things. Now how can I actually have an impact on this? So it's really interesting how through the course of my career, I've had these different moments, these different types of mountains, and trying to figure out how to stay motivated. And again, I'm lucky, I play a team sport. A lot of my motivation came within the locker room, within my team. I had teammates to look to, whether they were pushing me or I was pushing them seeing me succeed, me seeing them succeed. And that's really a big motivating factor for me.
What about for you, Kara, in terms of your job? And I think about your career too. You've been in Silicon Valley, different worlds in terms of sustainability. How do you think about, like, what motivates you in terms of your choices and then wanting to be part of Amazon and their mission?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I've worked in NGOs, I've worked in government, I've worked in now corporate America. And I think, you know, being on those teams and thinking about the different languages you have to be able to speak, I'm impact oriented. So what I really have been motivated by is trying to figure out a way. I've always wanted to make a difference, wanted to make an impact on the world. I've worked on human rights issues, I've worked on environmental issues, and I want to figure out what is, like, how do I use the resources and the scale of whatever I'm working on to kind of make that change. And in NGOs, you have influence in a different way. Government, you have scale, you have policy changes you can make. In corporate America, you have resources and you have a different kind of scale. And you have to kind of speak the language of the different team that you're on and the different kind of context you're in, but you have to remain authentic to yourself and you know, lead in the way that's going to make the folks around you understand the impact that you're trying to make and the context that you're in.
How do you guys think about the next generation in particular? And Sue, let me go over to you. You know, I think about the next, you really kind of changed the game, no pun intended, in terms of the attention that you've brought to certainly women's sports, women's basketball, on the college level, and then, of course, on the professional level. Like, you made a difference. Like, it's huge. And I think young women need to see that. So how do you think about that?
I mean, I've always taken great pride in that. I think what's amazing about this younger generation, and I can kind of tell the story within a story, if you will. When I got towards the end of my career and we were doing things like CBA negotiations, it was really the younger players. So if I'm, by the way, at this point I was like 37 and I was considered old. I'm still like,
that's so
figuring
unfair.
that out. I'm like, wait a minute, am I old? Am I young? But we had, you know, the younger players at that point in the WNBA were 21 to, let's say, 25, right? Like this age range. And for me, I had grown up in a era where we were fighting, but also just happy to have a league in a sense.
Yeah.
You know, and I hesitate to use this term, but we're all very familiar with the shut up and dribble, cringe. But that's really how it was a little bit. We were happy to have a league. We didn't want to push too hard because, oh, we don't want this taken away from us. And now, like I said, I'm in my late 30s, these players in their early 20s, so this younger generation you're alluding to, they were like, no. Like, we need charters. We need charter flights. What are we talking about? Like, no, this locker room, not good enough. And they really, it wasn't an entitlement as much as it was, this is what we deserve.
Right.
This is what's right. And I think the combination of the two generations, if you will, in our last CBA negotiation is really what got us to a really promising place, and it really set us up for the future.
Kara, for you, and I know we've talked about sustainability is something that a younger generation looks about. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and she's turning the things over, looking at ingredients. Where was this made? What's the carbon footprint?
Sure.
Like, they matter, and they care.
They do.
So how do you think about what you guys need to do at Amazon in terms of the next generation?
Yeah, I think increasingly this next generation, they both care a lot, they're incredibly passionate, and they have a lot of anxiety about what's coming and what the state of the world is. And so one of the things I think is our responsibility is, one, to act fast, to drive big solutions, but also to bring some optimism to it. We have time. We don't have a lot of time. We're in this decisive decade where we have to act now.
Right.
We have to move very quickly. And so I think one of the things that we need to lead on is to show that there are solutions, but we need to deploy them now. We cannot wait any longer. So one of the things leaders need to do is to take those decisive actions. We need to make changes now, and we need to make them at scale.
So I want to ask.
Well, that right now is Carol Masters' panel, along with Sue Bird, WNBA's all-time winningest player and co-founder of the media commerce company Together and the production company A Touch More. Also with Kara Hurst, Chief Sustainability Officer over at Amazon. We're live here at the Bloomberg Green Festival. Check out Carol's panel on Live Go on the Bloomberg terminal. Now to someone who's also participating in the festival here, but first a little bit of setup. You might recall yesterday how we talked about how an estimated 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to tourism, and that's predicted to double by 2050. It's the year that scientists have forecast as the tipping point for all sorts of ecological disasters. Worldwide aviation actually accounts for 2% of all carbon dioxide emissions and 12% of all CO2 emissions from transportation. So how can tourism and airplane travel fix its emissions problem? Some argue that the answer is 100% sustainable aviation fuel, and that'll play a big role. Curbing our long-haul international flights, too, will certainly be something that you have to keep an eye on as well. Our next guest thinks about this constantly. He's participating in a panel at the Bloomberg Green Festival about fueling airlines' decarbonization journey. Pleased to welcome Ryan Spees. He's Managing Director of Sustainability at Alaska Airlines. He's here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. Ryan, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Okay, so sustainable aviation fuel. It kind of sounds too good to be true. What exactly is it? Because right now it's just a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of the fuel that airlines use.
Yeah, SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, is, it can be almost like a miracle drug, but that doesn't exist in any quantities that we really need today. Sustainable aviation fuel can be made from things like fats and greases, oils. That's primarily what we're seeing today. But the next generation of those things is really where the fun science comes into play and where the carbon emissions comes down quite a bit.
Is it always made of byproducts, or are there certain crops that could be grown just for producing this fuel?
We haven't seen any crops grown directly for producing it. You're usually using byproducts, but the future technologies is actually all about pulling CO2 out of the air and transforming that with renewable energy and renewable hydrogen into jet fuel. It's something that can be dropped right into planes today, which is really exciting, right? You're not worried about taking the farm and making it into fuel.
Okay, I mentioned it's just a drop in the bucket right now. Right. The aviation fuel management software provider i6 Group says that only 0.1% of all jet fuel that's used worldwide is sustainable aviation fuel, and that has remained level in the last 4 years.
That number is definitely growing. It's certainly, we're seeing about 1% right now. And we're actually having demand much more every day. And so what we're seeing, and what the challenge is how do you scale up an industry that is 3 to 4 times more expensive than the industry that exists today? And so, we're thinking about technologies and investments, and where can we, as an airline, which doesn't have incredibly robust margins, spend our dollar wisely and spend the dollar of our guests wisely, so we're making the right choice for them, but also the planet. Really challenging.
So 1 gallon of sustainable aviation fuel is literally 3 to 4 times more expensive than a gallon of conventional?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Where are you getting it right now?
So primarily we're getting it out of a group in Montana that's doing fats, oils, and esters, and we're sending that to our Los Angeles airport and San Francisco airport.
How do you bring these costs down?
It's a great question. One is investment, but really the idea here today is finding great partners. So innovation happens in a lot of places, and that's why the Bloomberg Green Fest being here is an amazing opportunity to meet with our partners, folks like Microsoft, folks like Amazon, that have a vested interest in how do they bring their emissions down when they're traveling with their employees. And so finding those partnerships to help us offset that green premium is part of it. It's the deal with any scaling operation, right? How do we get more? We need to induce more demand, and we need to kind of keep that train rolling and having partners that help us along the way.
But are you just able to induce that demand by getting large corporate customers to pay more?
No, and that's actually a really exciting thing that Alaska has done. So we've engaged our guests on this journey as well. Back in December, we offered a promotion that if you bought sustainable aviation fuel with us, you got some elite qualifying miles. We sold over 500,000 gallons of SAF in December alone. In May of this year, we just offered that to our guests to do it in the bypass. So the first U.S. company to do that, where when you're buying your ticket, if you want to offset a piece of your flight, 5, 10, 20%, you can do that. You can help contribute, and every sort of piece helps. That's not the only thing as well, right? It's not just how do I get a guest to help me pay for this, or how do I find a corporate to help me balance this. It's also thinking about policy. Policy is incredibly important, and one that we've seen on the federal level with the Inflation Reduction Act has certainly helped. We want to take that a step further. We see credits expiring. How do we extend those? So there's so many levers that we need to be really engaged with, and at Alaska we are.
Does the lever need to be pulled by the government, by governments outside of the U.S. as well as by governments in the U.S.?
You're seeing both, right? So in Europe, it's much more of a stick approach, right? Mandates on percentages of SAF that you have to use. That's just sort of come into place, so we'll see how that market develops. Obviously, we're a much more carrot-focused market here in the U.S., and so you see incentives for building, you see incentives for delivering, and those are a different approach, and we're both going to see how this plays out. But I think both are really important, and so it's exciting to see how this industry will grow.
You sometimes hear terminology that doesn't exactly match what people think it means. So when you talk about sustainable aviation fuel, is it actually sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the life cycle, the science is certainly there behind it, but the challenge is not all SAF is equal, right? Each one might have a different carbon content or a life cycle carbon emissions associated with it, and so explaining that level of detail is challenging. We're always trying to think about it, not in just dollar per gallon, but dollar per ton. How much does it cost to reduce a ton of CO2? And we're thinking about that number, and that's what our guests are thinking about, and that's what our corporate clients are thinking about.
So what's the byproduct that's created when an engine burns sustainable aviation fuel?
It is CO2, so it's still burning it. The thing about sustainable aviation fuel is you're looking at the entire life cycle of how the fuel is actually made, right? Whether you're pulling fossil fuels out of the ground, which is traditional jet fuel, or you're using some lower carbon material in the production and process and transportation of that fuel. So at the end of the day, you're still burning some CO2, but if you look at the full life cycle, much reduced with SAF.
So how much does it decrease the carbon output of a traditional flight if it's still emitting CO2?
Yeah, so you're looking at, with SAF today, about a 40% reduction if you're putting that in a plane in the total life cycle. Our hope is to get up to 80 or 100% with the e-fuels that we talked about earlier.
Is this the only part of the solution when it comes to
It is
the impact that airlines have on the climate?
I would say it's the short and medium term solution for many flights and the long term solution for long haul flights. We believe in battery technology, but we believe that there's an opportunity for hydrogen to play a part. But those things don't scale quite at the same rate. If you think about flying from here in Seattle to New York, by the time you land today, or if you took that flight, the weight of the aircraft has gone down tremendously. If you do that with batteries, it's still the same weight. So you're really fundamentally fighting against something that's physics. And so we think that for those short and medium haul flights, new technologies will absolutely start to take hold. SAF will be there for the long term.
What about hydrogen?
We made an investment and actually donated a plane to Zero Avia, so they're looking at...
Yeah, we're joined by the CEO and founder later on the program.
Yeah, it's super exciting and an incredible talk. I know that we're all anxiously waiting for. That's a technology where we think, hey, there's some promise here. There's still a lot of infrastructure challenges with hydrogen. There's still a lot of, how do I get that to my airport? But we are investing and encouraged by it. but we'll see where it plays out.
Not to mention the production of the actual hydrogen, and it can be energy intensive too.
Very energy intensive, but that's the case with all these fuels at this point, right? And so we're encouraged by renewable energy, obviously dominating every new piece of energy that's going in the market, and that would help on the hydrogen side as well.
So right now, if you look at the fuel usage of Alaska Airlines, what portion is sustainable aviation fuel?
We are about 1%, and like most airlines here in the U.S., our goal is by 2030 to hit a 10% goal. It will be a challenge without all of those levers pulled at the same time.
Is it a realistic goal?
I think it is. I think the challenge is today, right? So there's, we're speaking on stage with John from Sky Energy and Microsoft on how do we get this plant built. So I think that there are absolutely opportunities to get us there. Not going to say it's going to be easy.
It's also, if you think about the sustainability element, you said you have a facility in Montana that you work with, and then you have to get that fuel then to the West Coast.
Yeah.
That's not exactly, carbon neutral.
Right. The infrastructure challenge is its own beast, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. We have some real challenges with getting SAF into SeaTac. So how do we solve those? Working with policymakers, working with partners, working with traditional oil and gas to solve some of those challenges. But yeah, I mean, most people don't ask where they're getting their jet fuel from in the start. So.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Do you think that we'll start to see traditional energy companies that make conventional aviation fuel get into this market?
I think they've dabbled. I think they're a bit waiting on the sidelines to see, is the demand really there?
Is it?
Yeah.
It sounds like it is, because if the goal is 10% by 2030, then the demand is there.
The demand is, the intention is there, right? But the demand to pay for it is still developing, right? And I think that'll be the biggest challenge. And honestly, if you're looking at the oil and gas markets, they're worried about their margins too. So they're doing what they need to do.
Well, one of our Bloomberg Intelligence commodities analysts, Mike McGlone, always says the cure for high prices is high prices. So if you have something that's high priced, you get more people coming into that market. It's just basic economics, right? Do we get to a point where you get so many people coming into the market because they see demand for it that you see price to fall in the coming years?
Absolutely, and that's where I think engaging our guests and engaging corporates and telling those stories about the demand that we have will encourage and will, hopefully incent production in the places that we need it the most.
Ryan Spees, Managing Director of Sustainability at Alaska Airlines, here from the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us on Business Week. Really do appreciate it. Let's head on over back to New York for an update on Wall Street, where we find Charlie Pellet with the latest in business news as well. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, thank you very much, Tim. Indeed, looking at a major rotation for the U.S. stock market on this CPI Thursday. Right to the numbers here. Yes, the Dow is higher, up 38 points right now, a gain of about 0.1%. The Dow 39,756, but the S&P is now retreating 45, back below 5,600, 5588 on the S&P, down 0.8%. Nasdaq Composite Index, a lot of damage there today, down 340, a drop right now of 1.8%, but an interesting day in terms of the rotation theme. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares up 3.4%, the Russell 2000 having its best day of the year. Dow Transport's higher as well, up by 2%. 10-year, 4.19%. The 2-year, 4.50%. Spot gold up $45 the ounce now, up 1.9%. 24.16, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.9%. 82.80 for a barrel of WTI. Wall Street traders are betting that the Federal Reserve will be able to cut interest rates soon. They sent bond yields tumbling while driving a strong stock market rotation. Earnings news. PepsiCo did report weaker than expected revenue growth as its snack food business was hurt by increasingly budget-focused shoppers and a recent Quaker Oats recall. PepsiCo shares, they're up 0.3% after earnings. Rival Coca-Cola up by 0.7%. Of course, the big earnings event for the week happens tomorrow morning before the open of trading, when we hear from JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. JP Morgan Chase up now by 0.1%. Citigroup right now lower by 1.8%. Wells Fargo back in the green, up by 1.4%. So again, recapping here, a very mixed market today. The Dow holding on to a gain of 0.1%. S&P lower by 0.8%. And the Russell 2000 surging 3.3%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, you know how the saying goes, this person needs no introduction, and it certainly stands true for our next guest. We are going to give her an introduction anyway, though. Gina McCarthy is a former U.S. EPA administrator under President Obama and the first White House National Climate Advisor appointed by President Biden. Gina is managing co-chair of the America is All In Coalition. It's a coalition of leaders assembled in support of climate action here in the United States, which is also led and supported by Michael Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Gina, also an operating advisor at Pegasus Capital Advisors and a senior advisor at TPG Rise Climate Fund. There's a lot more, but we'd run out of time if I read it all. Bottom line, she knows a ton about energy and climate change. She's with us here in Seattle at the Bloomberg Green Festival. Gina, how are you?
Great, great. How about yourself?
Doing well. Welcome to the
busy
program.
Place. It looks like it's a buzz.
Hey, the energy's great, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
What's the most
important?
As
long as it's clean.
Yeah, okay, there we go. I like that. What's the most important conversation today involving climate change?
Well, probably it begins with an admittance that we're not doing as well as we can and we've got to scale up. And I think that really then lends itself to talking a lot about partnerships. You know, we have a lot of good companies that are here represented, but honestly, we need more partnerships both across the U.S. and internationally to really tackle this at the scale that it deserves.
What type of partnerships? Because I was just speaking with Ryan Spees over at Alaska Airlines, and they're really relying on corporate partners to drive the change in sustainable aviation fuel because it costs 3 to 4 times as much per gallon than conventional fuel. So he wants the companies to pay more because they want to travel sustainably for business. Is that the type of partnership you mean?
I think it is about public-private partnerships, you know. So I mean, clearly the Inflation Reduction Act was an opportunity to give some public money to drive a whole lot more private investment. And we have to start thinking that way. I don't think it's either or. I actually think it's those partnerships that are going to drive this in a way that actually provides meaningful scaling of this opportunity, not just in the U.S., but globally.
Okay, where's the government involvement? You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes.
In your view, is that just the tip of the iceberg? Do we need more?
Well, we saw immediately after that happened, we saw the EU start driving new changes in Germany. So it's begun to take off, and people are realizing that it's a way for the public and private sector to really join together so that both of them can win. This is not about, you know, spending so much money in the private sector that you can't afford to do the deals. This is about how do we make these deals affordable by connecting public and private. But there's still a lot of opportunities for private companies to accelerate their markets, and they're going to take advantage of that, and we should let them.
You've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations. Why and when did the idea of climate change become so political in your view?
You know, it started off being pretty political because it took a whole lot longer time than it should have for us to recognize that this was a legitimate issue. And so now, of course, it still remains fairly political, but honestly, the politics starts to move out when you realize that the kind of technologies and opportunities we have today are going to make people's lives better. If it's going to keep us healthier, it's going to save us money, if it's going to create real jobs, which is what we're seeing today, the politics may still be there, but it doesn't have the punch it used to.
How much, speaking of politics, of America remains all in if it elects Trump in November, given his promises to eliminate what he calls the EV mandate, target offshore wind, and pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Look, I mention that what he said he's going to do, he's going to do. So that should give you your answer. I don't see the United States or globally the kind of progression we need on climate if we don't elect someone who understands climate and wants to move those issues forward.
And in your view, that is not the former president?
That is correct.
I want to welcome in Carol Massar, who just came running from the green stage. Great panel.
Thank you very much, because I did not want to miss talking with you.
Oh, thank you.
And we were just talking with Kara Hurst over to Amazon and also Sue Bird of the WNBA, and just the importance of platforms. But I'm listening to you guys. First of all, pleasure to meet you.
You too.
About politics. Are you scared in terms of what might happen in November?
And I think everybody should, because what's at stake is not just climate, which is the existential challenge of our time, but it's fundamentally our democracy.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about, because Are you concerned from climate, first of all, that we would go off in a very different direction? We would be more isolated? Because climate obviously has no borders, right? So never before have we needed to work together with everybody.
You know, we were just talking about that. It's going to take public-private partnerships, and it's going to take the U.S. and the other developed world to start investing in the developing world if we want to make this work. And those investments can't be coal. They can't be more natural gas. They've got to be the shift to clean energy and transportation that we know we can do.
Well, it is interesting because we know the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Agreement under Donald Trump, then President Donald Trump. He threatened to do it again if he's elected in November. You have pointed out, though, in terms of climate progress that's made by states, by cities, like the local level. I think about, we're going to be talking with the mayor of Seattle. Like the local level really matters, too.
You know, that's really what Bloomberg's America All In program is all about. And it's more than 5,000 people are joining together. And that's because subnational governments matter. If you remember when Trump was president before, the effort was to make sure that states and cities stood up and held the ground and kept moving forward. And that's exactly what happened. So we need to make sure that we're not going back again and revisiting that. We need to actually keep moving forward with all of the breadth of expertise and experience we now have that says that we can win this climate battle if we have the courage to stand up against folks that are deniers and start really supporting those folks who know what the future needs to be.
You were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the investment in clean tech manufacturing, clean energy projects under Biden, fed by the IRA. How much of that endures regardless of what happens at the polls in November? How durable is the investment that's been unleashed by the IRA and other policies that could be pared back if Trump wins the White House? Like, how vulnerable is it?
Yeah, when you look at the money, we're talking about something like $361 billion, right?
Right.
And this is just the start. This is a 10-year program. We just had our second birthday, I think.
Yeah.
So we have a long way to go. And we're talking about job growth that's in the plus 300,000 plus new jobs, right? These things matter to people. Human beings care about this. And so these are benefits that people can see and feel and taste. So that's why I believe will there be challenges? Absolutely. I expect that under a Republican administration, you're going to see lots of folks wanting to pull that out. You're already seeing bills in Congress being proposed to get rid of this and that. But when push comes to shove, we have more money going to Republican districts that are now building the manufacturing plants that they don't want to shut down. So if they want to go against their own constituents and their benefits, then more power to them if they want to risk it. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think we're going to hold the fort. We'll lose some. There'll be challenges, I think, internationally,
right?
But not just pulling out of NATO even. But these are the things, the large things that we have to think about that could be at risk.
30 seconds, Gina.
Yes.
I'm thinking about everybody who's listening.
Yeah.
What's the one thing every individual, take politics out, should be asking themselves when it comes to the climate environment?
What do they want as a future for their kids? What do they see right now as the challenges that they're facing? We can no longer hide from the climate impacts, but what we can do is grab a clean energy future for our kids. That's how we're all going to win.
It's certainly something we think about, right? You have young kids. I have a 21-year-old. We definitely think about it. Thank you so much and all the work that you've done. Really appreciate it. Gina McCarthy, I'm so glad I squeezed in on you.
We'd run out of time if I read all her titles and accolades.
It's really impressive, but it's why we wanted to talk to you. Gina
Former
McCarthy.
U.S. EPA administrator under President Obama, the first White House National Climate Advisor appointed by President Biden. Once again, she's part of the coalition, co-chair of America's All In Coalition, which is supported by Michael Bloomberg.
She knows something about the environment and climate change and all the work. We're just going to say that. If you missed any of it, check it out on our podcast feed. This is Bloomberg.
This This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Away from the closing bell. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec. We are live once again in Seattle, the Bloomberg Green Festival. A lot going on. Yeah, you can just feel the conversations, the narratives. It's just, I don't know, a lot of energy.
Yeah, it's been a great
Smart
first
energy.
hour. We got a great second hour and third hour coming up as well. In just a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell to talk all about how he's creating climate change resistance here in Seattle. He's creating a resistant city.
You know, Gene McCarthy just talked about the importance of cities and states, so we're going to get into that with him. Also, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's a satellite used to detect methane emissions. So that's something we're going to talk about. Really important to the environment.
And speaking of taking flight, we're going to be joined by the founder and CEO of a company that says it's building the first zero-emission engines for commercial aviation. We just spoke to Chief Sustainability Officer over at Alaska Airlines, Ryan Spees, all about sustainable aviation fuel.
Right.
Hydrogen, certainly part of decreasing carbon emissions when it comes to flying.
All right, lots more to come over the next couple of hours. Let's get a check, though, on the trade today on this Thursday. Let's send it back to New York and Charlie Pellet.
All right, I thank you very much, Carol and Tim. Not just Thursday, CPI Thursday, and we got a lot going on, a lot of moving parts to this market. Going to be very interesting to see how things shake out. 59 minutes to go until that closing bell clangs on Wall Street. Will we see a repeat of yesterday with all that buying into the close, or are we going to end mixed for the U.S. stock market? Right to the numbers here. We got the S&P trading lower by 43 points at 55.90. Good question there. Will we close above or below 5,600? Down 0.8% right now. We've got the Dow up 30, holding on to a gain of about 0.1%. On NASDAQ, hard hit today. Big rotation underway. NASDAQ down 319 points, a decline now of 1.7%. Cannot ignore the Russell 2000 today. It is surging 3.3%. The Russell 2000 up now by 67 points. Again, worth repeating, up by 3.3%. 10-year at 4.19%. The 2-year 4.50%. Gold up $44 the ounce, $24.15, up 1.9%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1%, $82.95 a barrel. So where does this morning's CPI report leave the Federal Reserve? Liz Ann Thomas is head of investment strategy at SoFi.
The Bloomberg Work function tells you that there's a 92% chance baked into the futures market now for a cut in September. I do think they will start to cut in September. There's been some narrative about whether or not they would do 50 to start off. I am not in that camp. I still think that they'll start with 25 so as not to scare anybody and do something much bigger than markets are expecting.
Liz Ann Young Thomas, head of investment strategy at SoFi. Earnings news now. Delta shares are dropping 5.43% after earnings. Delta expects profit this quarter to fall short of Wall Street's expectations as heavy competition in the domestic market drives ticket prices down. Delta, the first of the airlines to report. Other airlines trading lower as well, including United, UAL down 4.3%, American down 4.2%, Southwest down 2.6%, JetBlue up by 1.7%. Recapping, S&P down 0.8%, the Russell 2000 up 3.3%. Big rotation underway. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really do appreciate it. Quite the rotation happening into small caps, out of mega cap tech today.
Wait, wasn't
Charlie,
I on your other side?
Yeah,
Wait,
you were.
What happened here?
We switched. The magic of television and radio. Hey, we're live here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. 4 days of programming, innovators, policymakers, entrepreneurs, artists, activists, musicians. Everybody's here. The energy is high. It's something we talk about a lot, not just here at the Bloomberg Green Festival, is energy generation. Where energy comes from in the U.S., about 60% of all of our energy comes from fossil fuels, mostly coal and natural gas. Only around a fifth of energy comes from renewable sources such as wind, hydropower, and solar.
So how is that mix poised to shift? That's something we think a lot about. Why aren't we generating more from renewables? Also a good question. And is there actually money in renewables?
Okay, these are all questions I know our next guest can answer. Rob Barnett is Senior Energy and Commodities Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Jenny Chase is Lead Solar Analyst for Bloomberg NEF. both join us here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. Rob, Jenny, welcome. How are you guys?
Doing great. Enjoying the event.
Good.
Energy's great today.
The energy is great. Gene McCarthy said as long as the energy is clean, it's all good.
Exactly. Good point.
So I want to talk a little bit about just the mix of energy. We heard from Jim Coulter a little earlier, who basically said it's so much simpler to harness the energy from the sun than describing the process of getting carbons from in the ground. Rob, why is such a small mix of U.S. energy production coming from solar?
Well, you know, it is interesting. I would note just the latest EIA data actually shows that wind energy outstripped coal in the latest month. So we're generating more from wind than from coal right now. And so
but not more from fossil fuels. That's just coal.
Just coal.
Is that because there's more wind or less coal?
There's a lot less coal.
Sorry, Rob.
And a lot of
we rain on
by
parades.
gas.
That's what we do. We just rain on parades. Sorry.
But it is growing very fast from a small base. So, you know, if we had this conversation in 10 years' time, I think probably the opposite of what you just described will be true.
So, Jenny, I am curious. Like, I grew up and I remember the solar panels that were put on homes, the brand new homes. It was really cool. This is a long time ago, several decades. They never sold. When they finally sold, the solar panels were taken off. We're in a different environment. Have the tipping point in terms of renewables, are we there?
Oh, yes. I mean, what's happened over the last 20 years, which is roughly my career in this industry, is solar panels have got super cheap. I mean, when I started, you'd pay $6 a watt being a standard measure of a solar panel. And today in the US, you pay about 30 cents per watt. And in Europe, you pay 10 cents a watt, by the way, because we don't have all these trade tariffs on imports. So basically, these things have got so cheap that it makes a lot more sense. It's a lot less investment to put them up.
Not cheap enough, though, at least for me in the U.S. And that's, you know, something we struggle with. I mean, my electric bill is pretty high. But, Jenny, if I get solar, it would take about 8 years to pay for it on my current home.
Depends what state you're in and what incentives.
We're in New York. Yeah. Is this all about incentives?
I think at the moment in New York, but it's also, that's actually kind of circular. You know that Americans actually pay about 50% more for their home solar systems than your typical German does. And I think that's a skill issue, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah. So it's partly that you can charge that much because the incentives in New York are incredibly high. I mean, 8 years is actually what we normally say is about what makes residential solar consumers consume.
Okay.
And that does mean that your installers don't have an incentive to cut their costs that much. There's also a lot of paperwork, a lot of regulations that should...
Shocking.
Exactly. I mean...
The modules are the cheap bit. You know, 10 cents a watt. It's the guys up on the ladders on your roof that's where the real cost is at. And it's hard to crunch the labor component of the cost of putting panels on your roof.
It's also paperwork and regulation, especially in states like New York.
Lawyers, things like that.
So how do we shift? How do we change? So is it that we've got to just make it easier? Take the paperwork out? What is it?
I think that would actually really help if the local and federal governments could work together to strip out some of these restrictions to planning permission.
What are they worried about? Gas comes into my home, and I don't know. We seem to be doing just fine.
Well, there are some safety issues. There are some appearance issues. I mean, I don't care what my roof looks like, but some people do, and a lot of regulations that were probably originally set up to protect people that don't really apply because it's relatively difficult to hurt yourself with a solar panel. You can do it. You've got to be trying.
Rob, how much could the cost of solar decrease with regulatory changes? Like, can you give us an idea of a really light touch regulatory state in the U.S. where the installing solar would be so much cheaper?
Well, Jenny knows the stats better than I do, but Germany, let's say, is around a little over $2 a watt. U.S. is closer to $3 a watt to get it all in on your roof. And so Germany is probably the sort of region to look at and sort of say, what do they do? But what I would sort of conclude in an optimistic way is that only about 4% of households in the U.S. have solar right now. So the runway is still massive. A lot of opportunity, and a lot of states are really pushing this concept.
I will tell you it is. Maybe that's in the U.S., but in California, how high is that number?
It's much higher.
It seems massive. You drive around California, and it's like every new development has solar.
But the interesting thing about California is it's not just solar these days, it's solar plus batteries. So California changed its policy and said, look, if you want the really generous subsidy, you can't just do panels on the roof, you also have to do battery storage.
So
California gets about 25% of its electricity from solar. And in my 20 years as a solar analyst, I've learned that when the sun goes down, they stop generating. And that is a real issue.
It's funny how that works.
20 years.
Yeah.
I love
So, can solar ultimately go everywhere or no?
Yes, but there's not much point. Because at a certain point, you're generating in the middle of the day when you already have lots of electricity. And batteries can do some shifting of that.
Right.
But there are limits to how much you can shift with batteries economically. So I think that in the vast majority of places around the world, the limiting factor to how much electricity solar can supply is not space, not land. It is how much you actually need and you can usefully use in the middle of the day.
Yeah, it's going to be a portfolio. There's no solution that's solar only, probably. It's
We've
going to
got
be
to build
wind and
grids.
perhaps nuclear or perhaps hydrogen or other kind of technologies.
You know, you said the P word, portfolio, which really like kind of wakes up and perks, you know, all of the Bloomberg audience. So talk to us about the portfolio and where investors need to be kind of thinking about having conversations. Walk us through that portfolio. And Tim and I, we've talked a lot about nuclear. It's amazing how it's kind of back in the conversations, not just Bill Gates, but even before that, over the last couple of years.
Well, one thing that's challenging about nuclear is it's really difficult to invest in. So it's sort of a venture capital kind of private equity stage. There aren't great listed companies that you can really gain exposure to that theme. On the wind and solar space, there's a number of companies out there, but it's been a tough couple of years.
It's been brutal.
You know,
Tough is one way to describe it. I mean, a bloodbath is another way to describe it.
Why is it going to get worse?
Okay, so
it's not just rates. Is it all rates?
Oh no, I mean, I don't know what companies you're talking about exactly, but there's the ones that install, and they're going to be under pressure because fundamentally there are negative economies of scale in the installation business. I mean, one reason Germany is cheaper for solar installations is that you don't go to a national chain in Germany. You call up your local plumber or an electrician who also does solar modules, and they will put solar modules on your roof, and they have no marketing costs because they literally just put their number on the van. I mean,
wild, yeah, so different.
It's a very different structure, and partly the U.S. tax incentives are so complicated that it drives these national firms. And then the other sort of stocks you've got in solar are manufacturing stocks, and solar manufacturing is just a horrible business to be in.
Unless you're protected by the Inflation Reduction Act and U.S. tariffs. So the one counter example that I can give for Jenny's thesis on module manufacturing being a tough business is First Solar.
You guys should do a couple panels together. Oh, you are doing a couple panels. Okay.
Anyway,
so check out First Solar. They are right now they're running at a 45% gross margin business. But if you were to get rid of the IRA, that dropped to around 20%. So, you know, we are paying more for solar in the U.S., but there are companies that are actually benefiting from that. So, you know, if you're agnostic on how the company generates its profits, you can look at companies that are protected by the IRA.
What? One company.
What about other options? Is there other like we talk about wind, we talk about solar, we talk about nuclear. What else is going on there in either R&D? Is there stuff? I think about hydrogen. I thought.
So Jenny, I think already sort of mentioned this sort of batteries are a big theme. And so if you look at the residential developers that we have in the U.S., we've got three really big ones, Sonova, Sunrun, and SunPower. And they're approaching the point where about 50% of their customers, our new customers, are adding a battery alongside storage. So thematically, I think battery solar combo is going to be a big hit over the next couple of years. But that's not going to get you all the way to net zero. You are going to need some of these bigger technologies. There's a lot about enhanced geothermal these days, even that's very interesting happening in the marketplace.
You're also going to need to build a transmission grid. I mean, in the US, you've got a whole country, just one country, and you have more isolated grids than we have in Europe, which is like
it's okay.
Countries. I mean,
we'll send you on a grand tour, and you can see how bad things are.
But the thing about these,
but you're not wrong.
These regions not being connected is also that you can have negative power prices in one region, and then right next door you can have really high power prices.
Right.
And if you built a line between them, that would actually really help increase the amount of clean energy in the mix.
The reason I say how bad things are, I'm referring to Texas's grid, for example. And also California has an issue where, you know, it gets a really bad rap because the regulators ask people to plug in their electric cars at certain times of the day to reduce demand on the grid. So, in other words, it's a mess.
Mind you, that's quite a rational thing to do. I mean, if you've got these massive great batteries charging around, you kind of want to pay people to use them to support the grid.
Something that came up earlier, we have to, really quickly, should consumers have to pay for carbon? Is that how we change activities? Really quickly.
Yes, but indirectly, through higher prices for the activities that are high carbon emission.
People really hate price signals. So, in some sense, the IRA is a backdoor way of getting to the same solution.
All right, we will see. Rob Barnett, thank you so much. Senior Energy and Commodities Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Jenny Chase, Lead Solar Analyst for Bloomberg NEF. You guys, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.
Hey, let's get to Washington, or actually, let's go to New York City for an update on, we got business news and a check in the markets. Here's Charlie Pellet.
All right. Hi, thank you very much, Tim and Carol. Lots going on in U.S. markets today. Right now, with 45 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell, looking at a very mixed market. Yes, the Dow does remain higher, barely up 17 points, up less than 0.1%. We've got the S&P tumbling 45 at 55.88, a drop right now of just about 0.8%. NASDAQ hard hit, down 325 points, big rotation underway. We've got NASDAQ down 1.7%, while the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares on track for its best day of the year. Right now, the Russell 2000 up by 3.2%. 10-year, 4.19%. The 2-year, 4.50%. Gold up 1.9%, 24.16 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 1%, 82.96 a barrel. Bitcoin up 0.4%, 57,627 right now on Bitcoin. Traders today are betting that the Fed will be able to cut rates soon. That has sent bond yields tumbling, while driving that big rotation out of the tech mega caps that have powered the bull market in stocks. Sources tell Bloomberg Tesla is delaying its planned robotaxi unveiling to October to allow teams to have more time to build additional vehicle prototypes. We've got Tesla tumbling now by 7.6%. Earnings, specifically bank earnings tomorrow morning. J.P. Morgan Chase down now by 0.1%. Citigroup shares down 2.1%. Wells Fargo ahead of earnings, up now by 1.1%. So again, recapping, the Dow higher, up less than 0.1%. S&P down 0.8%. The Russell 2000 up 3.2%, and NASDAQ down now by 1.8%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
We are at the Bloomberg Green Festival live in Seattle. Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic. Now, we are here because of the city's impressive legacy of environmental leadership. They have had a focus on really building out a clean energy economy and really investing also in their communities, healthy, well-connected communities.
And yet, like other cities in the nation, it's struggled to come back after the pandemic. Earlier this year, Bloomberg News reporting that the daily worker foot traffic was at half of pre-pandemic levels, and office vacancy rates nearing 30%, thanks to a remote work world.
All right, well, joining us with more on the 18th most populous city in the United States and its citizens, and on the role really cities play when it comes to climate change and green policies, is Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell, live at the Bloomberg Green Festival. Thank you so much for finding time for us.
Thank you for having me.
And being part of this festival. You're just off a panel here at the Green Festival about the role of cities. We were just talking with Gina McCarthy about the importance of towns, cities, states playing climate change. Talk to us about your priorities when it comes to making your city greener.
Well, a few things. Number one is I think you've heard the cliche now, mayors get things done, and it's more than a cliche. It's actually how we are going to transform our climate battles, I believe. That we work with, for example, in our building emissions performance standard legislation that I proposed in the past, we look at our buildings, which is a high polluter. And we said we will reduce our carbon emissions by 27% by 2030. And this is at the same time we're trying to get better foot traffic down here, supporting small businesses. Amazon is based here, obviously, and the e-commerce has changed buying habits and where people go and live and play. And so at the same time, that is when you demonstrate your values. And so if we believe that this war against climate change is real, as we do, then this is the time to start staking out our plate. And so I think cities are best positioned to do this. And I said earlier in the panel, you know, I have one of the greenest, I think the greenest governor through Jay Inslee in the country. And so we have a good ecosystem of climate warriors
That
here.
helps, right? Tremendously.
Absolutely, it helps. And so from a state law perspective, they could pass policy that makes sure we're all working in unison with each other. But cities have the flexibility to go even further, and so that's what we try to do here in everything that we do. Transportation, of course, we're doing some incredible things in transportation. So I think cities are the best position to get it done.
Let's talk about transportation. In the 2 days I've been here, I've taken the bus, the light rail, the monorail. It's been pretty great. But this is still a city where a lot of people say they need a car. How do you change that?
So I proposed a $1.55 billion levy, a transportation levy, to look at our whole ecosystem. And it's all about choice. And, cars are getting smaller and they're becoming electrified. And so we don't have an anti-car campaign.
A lot of cars are getting bigger.
A lot of cars are getting, well, yeah.
In the U.S.
The Ford 150 is the truck that's still, yeah. So if your point is we're still car dependent, certainly are. We're looking at decades and decades of a culture in a country that's built out of Michigan, and looking at what GM and other companies have built. These are legacy organizations. So there's an ecosystem, and I don't pit cars against bikes. There's literally hundreds of millions of dollars in here for everyone in terms of building protected bike lanes. A person 85 years old may not ride a bike. We lead with transit, we lead with safety, we lead with equity. So I think here in Seattle, we're demonstrating this car versus bikes war, if you will, that we do it in a very civilized way, realizing that there still may be single modes of transportation, i.e. cars. They could get smaller and they're electrified, but this fight against climate change should be a unifying element. I talk openly about race. I talk openly about socioeconomic differences, that when people are hungry and you're talking about saving the planet, can you get their attention? You can when you change the narrative for it being a unifying and uplifting fight against climate change, and that's working here in Seattle.
Mayor Harold, let me ask you about that, because as a mayor, you've got to look at all of your citizens, and I too have walked around the city. I've walked down Pike Street. Your city's not alone in terms of dealing with homeless, a large homeless community. We see it certainly in New York City back home. I also think about office occupancies, right? People are staying home. They're working from home. Remote work is still a thing post-pandemic. Like New York and some other major cities, you have a lot of your office buildings that are vacant. How do you balance climate? I mean, that's our future, but how do you focus it against all of that too? That's pretty challenging.
It is very challenging. So the first question I think we try to answer is to get people downtown, as an example, if they're working from home, what drives people to downtown? There's certain things you cannot get through e-commerce. And again, we're the home to Amazon, so we support e-commerce. You can't get a beautiful art show or a beautiful song, or you can't buy that. And so we activate areas. You can't get daycare online, so to speak. And so we're looking at the new downtown, if you will.
Right.
Two things is it has to be activated that meets people's needs. And so you have a workforce that have young children, you should have daycare services, affordable daycare services in close proximity. People are very attached to their pets. So I asked the question, how many dog parks should we put around certain areas? Because with COVID, they got used to being around their pet all day.
Right.
These are real examples of how you could activate a downtown. More people are going to live downtown. I have about 100,000 people living downtown, right? So we're looking at, I passed legislation to convert.
What was it before the pandemic?
Oh, that number's been pretty consistent.
Okay.
These are residents. But
Got
what
it.
I did was I proposed legislation to convert office buildings to residential buildings, acceleration of permits, a lot of incentives to do that. Because we think more people will live downtown. You want to say something, Tim?
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick because I want to talk about the equity part of this. Because Carol and I stayed downtown at a hotel, and we were actually told by the front desk working at the hotel, avoid part of 3rd Avenue when you're out there. I did go by it on the bus. At what point do we come back here? And the front desk manager no longer says to us, avoid this. And he was saying it because of people there using drugs, unhoused people, and I saw a large police presence as well. But how do you fix that?
So let's not dodge that topic. What's happening in this country with the introduction of fentanyl and opioid, it is killing our country. It is a health issue. I have zero desire just to arrest someone, they go in jail, they come right back, and they go right back to the spot. I have to make arrests. Of course, we will make arrests, and we are making arrests based on someone presents a threat of harm. The health system in our country is such that I don't have control over that. Most cities do not. A few cities, I think Berkeley has their own health department. It's usually run by what's called a continuum of care, which is a county. So money goes to the county. What COVID showed us is that cities could be more nimble. Monies went directly to the cities and they could get things done. So right now there's many mayors, including myself, looking at how do we restructure the health strategies in our cities, because you're right. People are dying. You could buy a fentanyl pill for 50 cents, and they're committing crimes to support their habit. And so right now, I mean, we've recovered. We've been doing some incredible work getting these people off the streets. Now, we have to openly, I think, redesign the system, and we have to we're a rich city. Let's just be, we're one of the wealthiest per capita cities. And when you don't have the proper safeguards for people falling through the cracks, that's what they will do. And that's what you're seeing is people that could not, in a meritocracy, could not find their way to success. And there could be a host of issues they're dealing with, whether it's mental illness and who knows what the challenges are. So we're going upstream. We now invest in pre-K, brain development between 0 and 4. We're looking at the middle schools and the high schools trying to find the triggers. But what you're seeing out here is the result of, again, a successful city, people falling through the cracks, and a broken down health system. And we're trying to implode that right now to get them the help they need and get them off the streets.
So if you could change one more thing that you think would get them off the streets, what would it be?
Well, I'd like to have the ability to control the health dollars to get them treatment. They are sick, and you don't arrest a sick person, you treat them to try to get them healthy. And realizing there are bad people as well. So we're not afraid to make arrests to get the bad people off the streets. So if I had one thing to do would be to, and we're working on this, is to redesign the health strategies on these people you see dying on the streets.
You know what? Housing is also part of this conversation. It's part of the sustainability conversation. It's part of the green conversation. The cost of housing here is astronomical, like in many parts of the country. What are you doing in terms of encouraging developers, working with developers to build affordable housing to house some of these folks?
Yeah, so I passed the largest housing levy last year in our country's history. It's $970 million. And in that, it's all about affordable housing. It's making sure that the teacher, the barista, the healthcare worker can live in the city. We create incentives through tax incentives, if you will, to make sure that we reach 30, 50, 60% of area median income for people to live right here in the city. The fact of the matter is again, we are a rapidly growing city. I have wealthy people moving here. Supply and demand dictates housing prices. So my relationship with other cities becomes critical as well, because I want people to be sheltered, preferably in Seattle, but I have to realize the economics is such that it makes it a little tough here. With the median house being $900,000 to $1 million. My wife and I have 3 children, and when I look at, and one just got married 3 weeks ago, so during their house hunting, I'm thinking, wow, you have to come up with $100,000 to make a down payment here. And so you're looking at mom and dad for that. But,
congratulations.
So it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And so we get as creative as possible. We talk about the terms called apodments or micro units. We relaxed our standards for detached dwelling units, dadus, adus, attached, detached, to look at single-family zoning, building more. So we're being as creative as possible to make it affordable, but we are going against supply and demand. That's just the reality of it.
What do you make of kind of citizen dissatisfaction with the country? You see it playing out as we make our way to the November presidential elections, right? We talked about the economy doing okay, although we, see some softness in the labor market continuing. But what do you make of that disconnect that maybe we're not realizing some of the struggles of our citizens?
So this is what concerns me, and in the context of climate change, is that our younger generation, they understand the needs to protect our planet. They are getting dissatisfied when they see potential leaders that they somewhat feel like there's a disconnect. And I've won 4 elections in this city. I know how to debate. And one thing I never do, I never just denigrate my opponent. I just figure they're applying for the same job I'm applying for. This is what I have to offer. They have another brand, that's fine. But what you're seeing is this debate that I think, and I'm not even taking sides, I think that it's such a turnoff for the younger generation. Like, forget those 2 guys. I'm gonna disengage. That will hurt our country. What I want to see is one person says, you know what, I respect your opinion, but this is what I'm gonna do for this country. And we're losing that. So leaders like myself, elected leaders, we have to be louder than that radioactivity that we see. The younger generation being so turned off. I talked to all three of our kids about this. That scares me.
We only have 30 seconds left, but we got to get you to weigh in on the presidential election, because there are two men who have a lot of so-called double haters. Does
double haters?
Double haters don't like
Don't
either
like
of
either
them.
candidate.
Voters potential voters who don't like.
I haven't
either
heard
of them.
that double hater.
Yeah, it's what the pollsters are talking about right now. Does President Biden need to step aside to make room for another candidate?
So I'm not going to opine on that right now. I'm supporting Biden. I'm a Democrat. That's just, I'll wear that. I've developed somewhat of a relationship with him, so I'm not calling on him to step aside. He had an awful debate, he by his own mission, but I listened to him speak the other day, and he was just as punchy as ever. And so I'm not calling. I know a lot of people are doing that right now, and I respect everyone's opinion. So, but I'm not on that bandwagon, especially this late in the game, by the way. So I'll just sort of leave it at that. My biggest concern, again, is the younger generation, the double haters, as you describe it. So,
Well, and you wonder about the younger generation. Maybe they're looking for a younger candidate, right, to vote for, like going forward. So,
well, since I'm not part of that generation, I won't speak for them.
Listen, thank you for speaking, though,
Thank
to
you.
us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Mayor. Good to see you. Thank you. Hey, let's send it back to Washington, or to New York now, excuse me, and Bloomberg headquarters, where in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, we find Charlie Pellet with an update on the day's trade. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, and here's what's going on, Tim and Carol. We got 29 minutes to go before that closing bell clangs on this CPI Thursday. Going to be very interesting to see if the Dow holds onto its gains, right now higher by 19 points, up just under 0.1%. The S&P, though, in the red, down 48. We got a big rotation underway. Right now, we got the S&P down 0.9%. NASDAQ down 350, a drop there of 1.9%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 2.1%. But interestingly, the Russell 2000, this is where the rotation comes in. That index of small cap shares enjoying its best day of the year. The Russell 2000 up now by 3.4%. Wall Street traders are betting that the Federal Reserve will be able to cut rates soon. That sent bond yields tumbling while driving a big rotation out of the tech mega caps that have powered the bull market in stocks. A gauge of the so-called Magnificent Seven mega caps on track toward its biggest loss since July of 2028. Tesla, by the way, plunging today on news that it is postponing its planned robo-taxi unveiling to October. Right now, we've got Tesla down by 8.2%. Again, the 10-year, 4.19%. The 2-year, 4.50%. Spot gold up 1.9%, higher by $45 the ounce to $24.16. Crude, West Texas Intermediate, up 1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Well, I spoke earlier with Ryan Spees, Managing Director of Sustainability over at Alaska Airlines, about airlines' decarbonization journey.
Yeah.
It's going to be a journey. It's going to be tough. I mean, no question that airlines want to get there.
They need more of that, right? An alternative sustainable aviation fuel.
They
and
need
it's not
more
easy.
than just
I know, they need a lot.
Yeah. International air travel's share of CO2 output is set to climb dramatically as other segments decarbonize. So as you see other parts of the business community use and emit less carbon, the share of airlines' carbon is going up.
Right.
It's going to be an estimated 22% by 2050 from 2% today if emissions aren't cut fast enough. This is according to a Bloomberg Big Take published last summer.
That's an incredible ramp up. So how do we get there? Sustainable aviation fuel, that's something, you guys talked about. eVTOLs or battery-powered electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Our next guest says he's got a solution, but the only way to get there is with hydrogen. Val Miftakhov is the founder and CEO of Zero Avia. It's a company that says it's developing the world's first zero-emission engines for commercial aviation. Great to have you back with us. How are you?
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you.
It's good to have you here. Remind our world, since it's been a little while, of what you are working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So we develop new generation of engines for commercial aviation, large aircraft going long distances, taking a lot of passengers. So we think the prime solution for that is hydrogen as fuel, and then hydrogen fuel cells and electric powertrain to bring the aircraft into the new future.
How far can it go?
It can go, actually, so we have different programs. Yeah, we start with the small aircraft and then go larger and larger. The largest aircraft that we can repower will go the same distance as, my flight later today goes to London, for example, right? So we believe that within the next 20 years or so, we will have engines for aircraft of that size and being able to go that type of distance.
Do you have to build entirely new aircraft, or can you strap a pair of these
For those,
737
for those
Max?
distances, you would have to modify the aircraft. Generally, you can get about half the maximum range of the fossil fuel aircraft without modification of the aircraft, or with minor modifications, yeah? And that's our first launch, will be like that. And then we work already with the aircraft manufacturers. You know, Airbus is one of our major investors, for example. We already work with aircraft manufacturers on what's called clean sheet design, where they design aircraft around our engines.
Val, why 20 years?
Well, you know, if you look at the current engines, yeah, those beautiful things, huge engines off the wings of the aircraft, they've been in development from 1960s, right?
Yeah.
So, and actually even before that, right? So right after the World War II, the first jet engines were developed. So we had almost 100 years of development, if you will, right? So 20 years is not that huge of a time, really, right? But it's what it takes to get the technology up to that level.
All right, Val, Mother Earth is calling and saying we're running out of time. My point is, if the technology's there, is it a case of those engines are really expensive, those planes are really expensive, and the cost of that changeover is what's holding things back?
Yeah, that's a significant component, yeah, especially in aviation, because, you know, you look at the automotive market, right? And my previous company was in the EV space, electric vehicle space. And there you have the lifetime of vehicle is just 10 years. And we've been already, since Tesla delivered Model S, it's been already been 14 years. But we're still below 10% of the fleet, right, converted. In aviation, it's even worse. The lifetime of the commercial aircraft is 30 years. So, you know, if it will take several generations, then we're not there by 2100, you know? So we need to really push from the government side, from the operator side for fleet replacement very much sooner.
Sounds great. You still need to get the hydrogen, though. Where do you get the hydrogen?
Yeah, well, and we're here in Washington State, right, which is great because the grid is largely renewable, so we believe in green hydrogen production. We actually make all of our fuel for our testing ourselves.
But that uses a lot of electricity.
Yeah, it uses a lot of electricity, but you need electricity anyway to electrify, right? So you need energy, you need primary energy. Now, hydrogen electric approach, the approach that we have, is the most efficient way to use that energy. So think about hydrogen in our aircraft as effectively a energy carrier for renewable energy. Is that the batteries are too heavy, fundamentally too heavy, right? Theoretically, you cannot make them light enough, yeah? You can make them lighter than today, yeah? But it's still not going to be sufficient for a large aircraft going long distances. Hydrogen is the best carrier of that energy. So nothing else will really work, right? And sustainable aviation fuel you mentioned, the small portion of that can be made with biofeedstock, but this can repower less than 10% of aviation, right? For everything else, you would have to go what's called e-fuels, electrofuels, which start with green hydrogen and then add carbon capture, then adds additional chemical processes and all that. So the cost of that is so much higher than utilizing hydrogen in hydrogen electric that we think that, you know, we'll have some transition period with biofuels, and then hydrogen electric is what will take us to the real future.
What do we need in terms of government policy? You mentioned the government involvement. What specifically?
Yeah, so we need, and you know, we have some blueprints.
For the government to lead, yeah. How
we
so?
have some blueprint already from the EV industry, right? So a lot of the transition was driven by the progressive governments like California, for instance, right, with the low carbon fuel standards, with emission standards, and then, you know, there's some examples outside of the U.S., like Norway, for instance, right? Great policies to bring 90% plus new vehicles being sold are electric. Yeah, so policies like that for fleet modernization will be super important, and we are launching our first commercial product within the next 2 years. So we are talking to the government saying, hey, you know, the technology is there. We're now officially in certification with the regulators across the world, and it will get here before, you know, 2 years, 3 years out. So we need the policies right now.
What does that route look like? Who are the operators who are taking that plan?
Yeah,
like,
so
you need buy-in from all constituents here.
You need demand.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we already have over 2,000 engines on our order book, which is give or take $10 billion worth of future revenues already pre-booked. We have announced the production facility, actually right here in Everett. Our first production facility going to be in the state of Washington, which is great.
aviation history and industry.
Yeah. And we're taking over Collins Aerospace engine production. So it's like a great story, you know, fossil fuels. Right. So we already have demands, right? So you mentioned Alaska Airlines, right? They're our customer, they're our investor. We have United, American, British Airways, Amazon. So ecosystem is already supportive. I mentioned Airbus, yeah. We just signed also the world's largest deal with all 3 major airports in Canada, for example, Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, plus Airbus and us together to bring them to hydrogen future, right? So the ecosystem is getting around this vision. Now we'll need the governments to really push it, help us push it.
Is that the biggest challenge? Just got 30 seconds left here. Is it just you need the government buy-in to be a little bit more aggressive with this?
Yeah, and in 2 ways, right? So we are now in certification, which means that we're working with government regulators to bring it to the markets, and we need the right level of priority to this project, and then once it's done, actual help in bringing the fleets over.
10 seconds, you said you're getting on a plane to London tonight. What year will that plane be powered by your engines?
It will be powered, we will have engines like that by 2040.
All right, countdown is on.
Not sooner? I told you Mother Earth is calling.
I'm realistic, right? So you know, it's a lot of startups out there. You know, they say things that they cannot deliver, and then they fall on their faces. You know.
Val, good to check in. We look forward to next time already. Val Miftakhov, founder and CEO of Zero Avia, right here at the Green Festival in Seattle.
Hey, coming up next, we're going to drive to the close with the head of TMT research over at S&P, Visible Global Alpha. But before that, check the day's trading top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much. We got investors bailing out of the so-called Mag 7 stocks, including Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta Platforms, and Tesla. Tesla, by the way, it is plunging today after delaying that robo-taxi. Shares of Tesla today, they are slumping now. We've got Tesla down by just about 7.7%. Bottom line here, very mixed market with the Dow Industrials up 16, a gain of less than 0.1%. We've got the S&P 500 index down 43, drop there of 0.8%. NASDAQ down 1.7%, down 322 points. The NASDAQ 100 index, full of those big tech names, down 2%. Interestingly, though, with a major rotation underway, the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up 3.7%. Russell 2000 on track for its best day of 2024. 10-year at 4.20% with a 2-year 4.51%. And right now we have got, as I mentioned, stocks trading mixed with the S&P 500 index down 44, a drop there of 0.8%. Gold up 1.9%. Crude oil up 1.1%. S&P down 0.8. Russell 2000, that perhaps one of the big market stories today, the Russell 2000 up by 3.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we're just about 18 minutes away from the close on this Thursday. As you heard from Charlie Pellet back in New York, we've got a bit of a rotation underway. Investors moving out of some of those big cap names, kind of some jockeying for position, if you will, off of that weaker, softer inflation print, and so maybe not as much interest in some of the big cap names that have been on a run.
It's funny because traditionally when you see a drop in yields like we're seeing today, you know, but now big tech is considered a safe haven. So with that drop in yields, they're moving into small caps. The Russell 2000 having its best day so far this year. Riskier, yeah.
Which is interesting. All right, so let's see what Melissa Otto. I know, exactly.
What a world.
All it takes is 24 hours for the shift. Melissa Otto is with us. She is TMT analyst at S&P Global Visible Alpha, and she joins us from New York City. Melissa, interesting day, a big inflation print, certainly our focal point. What's your explanation of the trade and what's going on right now?
Hi, thank you. The CPI data was encouraging, and what it did was put the potential for a September rate cut back on the table, which is essentially a catalyst for what you're seeing in terms of that rotation from large cap into small cap, particularly for the tech sector.
It's wild to be calling, mega cap tech, this idea of a safe haven. You know, traditionally when, when you see rates fall, it's good for tech companies. That's traditionally how it's been. How do you explain the rotation today?
It's, I think coming into this earnings season, companies, particularly in the tech sector, that have performed very well in the first half, who've seen their valuations start to look either fully valued or a little bit stretched, are going to have to beat expectations, not just in the quarter, but in terms of their guidance, in order to maintain the momentum in their stock prices. If they don't, there may be some volatility ahead.
You know, what's interesting too, and I wonder, Melissa, if we get to the point that if things are slowing down and the Fed says it's okay or getting closer to cutting rates, at some point do we start to think, oh wait, we're slowing down, slower growth, that might show its way in terms of earnings. We could see more people maybe out of work. And so we have to think about the slower growth story as well. Is that part of it?
We'll see what the jobs look like tomorrow. I think what we've seen so far is that the Fed's done a decent job of maintaining a relatively good balance between the jobs numbers and getting inflation to move on a downward trajectory. So, we'll see. I think step by step.
Melissa, you mentioned the first half of the year. I mean, double-digit gains for the S&P 500 and for the NASDAQ. We're at more than 30 records for the S&P 500 so far this year. What does the second half look like?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? That's the thing that I'm going to be laser focused on this earnings season is I can't wait to hear what a lot of these mega cap companies are going to guide to, what sort of commentary they're going to make, how the outlook may or may not shift. Currently, expectations are looking pretty robust for the second half. We'll see, what sort of guidance the companies give that will enable there to be sustainability of that or some upside to that. But if not, we could be in for some volatility.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the VIX, we've talked about it being low. I haven't looked at the VIX yet today, but it's certainly we've seen it low historically. When there's a lot of complacency, it makes me a little nervous. What are the biggest risks at this point? Is it the earnings fundamentals? Is it politics? Or is it just that we've had such a run-up in stocks already this year that we need to kind of settle down a little bit? What are the biggest risks in your view?
I think from my perspective, it's missing expectations. So companies that come in, even if they fundamentally deliver a decent quarter and guidance, if it is below what the market has priced in, they could be punished for that. And we started to see indications of it last quarter where, especially some of these smaller, lesser known companies, we were seeing that. And I think, if we start to see that happening in the large and mega cap stocks, that might be a signal.
Well, it's interesting. A Bloomberg gauge of the Magnificent Seven mega caps headed toward the biggest loss since July of 2023. An equal weighted version of the S&P 500. So NVIDIA may be carrying the same heft as like a Dollar Tree.
Yeah.
It actually jumped. So it's a little perspective.
So
in
the
terms
rotation
of the
out of big tech, we're starting. Is that good news to you that we're starting to see the rally broaden out a little bit?
It'll be interesting. I'm excited for this earnings season to kick off with Netflix. And Netflix will set the tone for the rest of the big mega caps. When I look at the numbers, S&P Global Visible Alpha Consensus is looking for $38.8 billion in revenues at a 25% margin. Let's see what Netflix comes out with, what sort of commentary they give around the outlook, what their ad-supported business is going to do, and how they are thinking about that margin for the rest of the year. I think that'll be a really critical data point.
Hey, Melissa, how are you thinking about politics and political risk? You mentioned that it's certainly something that's on your radar, but how are you thinking about it second half of the year?
Markets are terrible at discounting for political risk, so I'm not really sure. I think basically what I think most investors try to do is just focus on the numbers and see where the upside is, especially relative to expectations. All
right, we're going to leave it on that note. Melissa, thank you so much. Really appreciate your input today. Melissa Otto, She is TMT analyst and joining us, of course, on Zoom in New York City. Great to check in with her. She is TMT analyst at S&P Global Visible Alpha. I just want to get that correctly. Kind of an interesting trade and a kind of a shift in the if you think about the number of records that we've had consecutively.
Yeah.
Certainly on the S&P 500.
The NASDAQ composite down 1.8% right now, so off its worst levels of the day. Same with the S&P 500 down 0.8%. An interesting trade if you open up the S&P 500 and see what's actually moving inside the S&P. Like you mentioned, the equal weight index performing better than the market cap. But look, you got NVIDIA down 5% today. You got Microsoft down 2.4%, Apple down 2%, Tesla down close to 8% on that news that our team reported earlier about delaying the robotaxi a couple months to October.
And I'm looking at the individual names. You've got almost 400 names in the S&P 500 actually higher today.
Yeah.
So it's important to kind of look within the index.
Good point.
114 that are to the downside. Again, it's some of those big mega caps that really shifted. It's not all bad, but that's what makes a market.
Just the big tech.
All right, everybody. You've got the close coming your way in just about 10 minutes time. Tim and I will be breaking it down along with Charlie Pellet. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week live in Seattle, the Bloomberg Green Festival, and this is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got 7 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. Tesla shares, they are now down by 8%. Sources tell Bloomberg Tesla is delaying its planned robo-taxi unveiling to October so teams working on the project can have more time to build additional vehicle prototypes. CEO Elon Musk, you recall, set the initial August 8th date for the event months ago, and optimism about the spectacle has contributed to an 11-day streak of gains that has added more than $257 billion to Tesla's market cap. But today, that Bloomberg News story putting the brakes on Tesla shares. Again, Tesla down by 8.1%. Bloomberg News says the postponement has been communicated internally, and the car maker will show the vehicle now in October. Abercrombie & Fitch is a company in transition as it moves away from its teen roots. Today, the shares are little changed. Fran Horowitz is the CEO. She stopped by Bloomberg Television this morning to talk about the evolution of the company.
We have really changed our addressable market. You know, the Abercrombie in the past that people reference was much more of a teen consumer. We've really opened up that space for Hollister and made that the global iconic teen brand. And Abercrombie has truly aged up. The consumer today, they start to shop with us in their early 20s. They still stay well into their 40s. So that's a big shift for us that will clearly support the sustainability of the business.
Abercrombie's Fran Horowitz. Argus Research, meanwhile, downgraded the apparel company to hold from buy on valuation concerns. ANF, Abercrombie & Fitch right now, down by roughly 0.2%. PepsiCo reporting weaker than expected revenue growth. PepsiCo shares today, they're up by 0.1%. Those are our top company stories, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, just got about 5 minutes left in today's trading session, so getting ready to wrap up that Thursday session. Having said that, one name certainly on our radar, you heard Charlie talking about it, and that is Tesla. Stock down 8% in today's session. And that's because of a delay.
Yeah, our own Dana Hole and Ed Ludlow reporting that Tesla is postponing its planned robo-taxi unveiling to October to allow teams working on the project more time to build additional prototypes. That's according to people familiar with this decision. This a Bloomberg exclusive, and Tesla shares fell more than 8% just after Bloomberg News first reported that the company planned to delay an event to unveil that robo-taxi by a few months.
Two months.
I know, but Carol,
and listen,
when this
is a company that delays. Elon's known
Carol,
for delays.
Okay.
I'm not
Jason
taking
Kelly,
his
we're going to
side.
speak to Jason Kelly in a few
Yes,
minutes, but
we are.
When he was talking to Jim Coulter, they brought up a video of Elon Musk talking about autonomy back in 2014.
I know.
Okay?
I know.
The joke about autonomy at Tesla is next year, next year, next year. Well, you know what he finally said this year, and when he said that it would happen in August, we all asked Ed Ludlow the question, is this thing actually happening? And, you know, you have to take it with a giant grain of salt because it's always next year.
All right, I'm just going to
So
ask.
October, is this going to be the last delay?
I don't know. I'm going to ask. We've got
There was supposed to be a fleet of robo-taxis
half
around
a
here.
dozen people in our crew. Show your hands. You guys can't see it. Raise your hands. Would you get into an autonomous vehicle? No driver. Yeah, nobody's lifting their hands up. I think that's part of the problem, right? We talk about with EVs, you need the infrastructure. You need to be able to plug in your batteries. I don't know that I would get comfortable getting into a car that has no driver. Would you? Have
I
you?
would do it in San Francisco. I would take one of those.
You would.
Yeah.
And Ludlow's done it.
Yeah. Oh, he does it all the time.
Yeah.
And now they've opened those up. We're talking about the Waymo vehicles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would do it in San Francisco.
All right, so
I don't know if I
Elon
want
Musk
to be
said
on
the
roads
initial,
with a bunch
so
of those.
August 8th, is that the next date that we have to look for these?
That was the initial August
that was the
date.
initial
Now we got
one.
an
So
outlook for October.
So now we have a couple more months.
Look, and shareholders responding to this. Shares down 8%.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, when you think about where the new growth comes from, and this is something he's been talking about, you get it. I mean, but this is still a company that we have seen some significant runs in. So we'll see what happens. Stay tuned.
Dan Ives out with a note that said it didn't change the way he thinks about the opportunity for Tesla.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah,
But
he's bullish.
He's bullish.
He's
I
a
was going
bull.
to say, he tends to be upbeat.
He's
All right,
very
everybody. We have just a few minutes left in today's trading session. You've got, the S&P just off its lows, down by 0.8%. The NASDAQ 100, we're looking at a decline of about 2%. So that's where you're seeing the big hits. Carol Massar, Tim Stenevec, the close coming your way in just a moment.
From From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. A mixed Thursday, a CPI Thursday, on to the closing bell with the Dow holding on to a 50-point gain right now. 2 minutes to go before we get the close, up right now by about 0.1%. S&P down 46. Big rotation underway today with the S&P falling by 0.8%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 349, a drop there of 1.9%, while the Russell 2000 today surged 3.6%. It will have its best day of the year. Investors bailing on the so-called Mag 7 stocks. Those are Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta Platforms, and Tesla by the most in nearly a year as inflation data spark bets that the Federal Reserve will be cutting interest rates as soon as September. Our Abigail Doolittle will have a whole lot more on the markets coming up for you in just a moment. Bottom line here, we have money flowing out of those big tech names into small caps. Melissa Otto is TMT analyst at S&P Global Visible Alpha. She was a guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
The CPI data was encouraging, and what it did was put the potential for a September rate cut back on the table, which is essentially a catalyst for what you're seeing in terms of that rotation from large cap into small cap, particularly for the tech sector.
Melissa Otto of S&P Global Visible Alpha, again, worth repeating on the Russell 2000, up today, up big time, up 3.6%, and the S&P was down 0.8%, a drop there of 45 points. The S&P going to close below 5,600 with the S&P 500 index 5586. And there you have it. It is a wrap. Sound of the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange as we wrap up trading. Dow Industrials up 38 points, up 27 points, a gain of 0.1%. The Russell 2000 up 3.6%, 10-year 4.20%, the 2-year 4.50%. Gold up $43 the ounce, 24.14, up 1.8%, and West Texas Intermediate crude up by 1.2%. Recapping a mixed day, S&P down 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, Charlie Pellet giving you the closing numbers back there at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Let's get a little bit more insight and analysis into the trade. With us is Bloomberg News Chief Markets Correspondent Abigail Doolittle, also back at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. Abigail, this felt like a little bit of a different trade today.
With the S&P 500 down 0.9% here on the closing bell. We also have the Nasdaq 100 down 2.2%, and not surprisingly, it has everything to do with big tech, those heavyweight names to these indexes. Nvidia down 5.6%, Microsoft down 2.5%, Tesla down 8.4%, Apple down 2.3%, Meta down 4.1%. So lots of selling of these tech names. And in terms of when this is the worst day relative for the S&P 500 since the end of April, and for the Nasdaq 100, let's see if it goes back just a little bit further. It does. So this is the worst day for the Nasdaq 100 of the year, the worst day since October 25th of last year. That was the sell-off that was ahead of the rally that we've had over the last few months. So a lot of people really noting the fact that, on the other hand, you have the small cap stocks trading higher, that Russell 2000 up 3.7%. What I would really note is that it's the inflation report. It's not just about the expectation of a cut coming sooner than had been expected, or an additional cut to rates. I think it really has to do with that yen. It's strengthened significantly right on that inflation report relative to the dollar. It hit the 50-day moving average today. It may be heading lower. The dollar yen may be heading lower, meaning there's yen strength. And that carry trade, that cheap money that's been on the yen weakening, it really unwound and took a chunk out of some stocks, but not all. The Russell 2000, those small caps did benefit.
Yeah, Abigail, Carol making the point earlier that you had pretty much 4 stocks in the S&P 500 moving higher for every 1 stock that moved lower today. So a decline of 0.9% on the S&P 500, just going to show that it was concentrated in the mega cap tech stocks. And that's why we saw the decline on the index level. But you talk about the Russell 2000, talk about the broadening out of the rally that we're seeing, because that's another angle that a lot of people are talking about today.
Well, it is interesting because another way of looking at that in terms of the sell-off today for the S&P 500 really being concentrated in big tech, from a sector standpoint, and this is very similar to the movers versus decliners, we have 7 sectors trading higher, 4 lower. The 4 that are lower, of course, all by more than 1%, between 1 to almost 3%, and that's depending on which index, somewhere between 30 to 50% between the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. On the other hand, real estate, utilities, materials, industrials, energy, financials, healthcare, all higher, up by about 0.7% or more. Real estate up by 2.7%, having to do with yields down on that slightly softer CPI report. Those dividends look a little bit more attractive. Plus, if they were to cut in September, that could be very good for real estate. Something I would point out, it does seem as though there is some sort of a trend toward the idea that inflation is not as painful as it had been and that it is down. But, it was softer by just a little bit. So we continue to have these extreme moves to slight misses to either the upside or the downside, telling you how tightly wound investors are. And as for the Russell 2000, I was looking at a chart of it not so long ago, and it's basically at the top of its range, above the top of the range, trying to peak out of there for sure. And it's the best day, I'm guessing, of the year. But I'll be able to tell, since November of last year. So lots of extreme moves here. Let's wait to see what tomorrow brings, how it smooths out a little bit.
All right, good stuff. As always, Abigail Doolittle, our Bloomberg News chief markets correspondent back there in New York City. And I'm just thinking the yield trade is really the significant one. I was thinking if we were with the TV gang right now, we would be talking about, you're talking about 416 on the 10. I mean, you saw some significant moves.
You see mortgage rates fall as a result of that?
Exactly.
Below 7% maybe
and that
next week?
certainly will shape the equity trade, but also behavior in general. So something we're keeping a watch on. All right, Abigail, thank you.
Well, speaking of changing behavior, that's what our next guest is certainly trying to do. Because back in March, a SpaceX rocket made history. It blasted off carrying a special payload, MethaneSat, a highly specialized satellite that can spot methane leaks from the oil and gas industry. A missions carol that other satellites can't see, and with it, it ushered in a new era of climate transparency.
That's right, the goal to motivate and enable urgent action to reduce methane emissions. Now, MethaneSat, we want to talk about that because it's this incredible collaboration between the Environmental Defense Fund and organizations including aerospace companies, you've got space agencies also around the globe, academic institutions, and the nonprofit environmental advocacy group, the Environmental Defense Fund.
We've got with us the project lead of MethaneSat, the guy who made it happen. Stephen Hamburg is Senior Vice President and Chief Scientist at EDF. He joins us here on site at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. We should note Michael R. Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies is a supporter of EDF. Bloomberg Philanthropies is the philanthropic arm of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg Radio. Welcome. First of all, congratulations. That March launch was a very, very big deal.
Absolutely. We couldn't be more excited. But really now it all begins, because getting it into space and making sure it works is the first step. But the real issue is how do we generate the data and make sure it's actionable?
So what's the data that it's found?
Well, so far we've only been really testing. We've downloaded data and it's looking really good. We're really excited because it's really highly precise data. That's what we need to be able to answer the 3 basic questions.
Okay, so let's answer those 3 basic questions, because I want some context here to take a big step back and understand exactly what MethaneSat is measuring here. Because there's an issue with gases being released that are invisible to the naked eye.
Absolutely.
And that happen all over the world.
Correct. So what we need is a global picture, and we need to be able to figure out where are those emissions occurring, how much is being emitted, and how they're changing over time. And we need to do that across the entire sector, and we can do that with MethaneSat because we designed it with such high precision, and we are delivering the data as actionable data, meaning we're actually doing the processing to get it all the way to how much is being emitted from where.
Where is this data going to go?
So the data is going to be posted, public. Anybody can look at it. It's free of charge for any non-commercial use.
Right.
And it will also be, of course, ingested into systems that allow it to be able to be integrated into whether financial services or whether it's just into regulatory processes. And so we have a whole team, because just producing data doesn't, you guys know it, doesn't cause change.
Right.
So we have a whole team from producing the data all the way through the action. So there's a whole group that works with us on advocacy, ensuring that the stakeholders are engaged, that people understand how to use the data. Because these data have never existed before. We have to get people to understand how to use them.
Are the stakeholders engaged, Stephen?
Absolutely.
I'm sure some of them are going to be a little fearful, right, in terms of what this data is going to show.
Absolutely, because it's going to show, obviously, those who are doing a good job and those who are not.
Right.
But absolutely. So the oil and gas industry knows that the things are changing. Transparency will be part of the future. And we're seeing also in the financial industry, we're seeing a lot of interest. I just spent a lot of time going to many of the major financial institutions talking about this. So we are seeing engagement, but it's still early days.
What do the financial institutions want to know?
They want to know how the data is actionable, right? And part of it is a conversation. So we're asking, what do you need to use it to make more informed decisions? And it's not just, so we have the financial sector, but we also have regulators. What do you need to know? So we have multiple different stakeholder groups, including civil society. And we are working with those groups to make sure we understand what type of data will be most effective for them to take the actions they need to take. And that's, again, something no one's ever done before, creating these diverse products out of a single data stream.
But is the action basic in the sense that we need to make sure we trap the methane that's being released into the atmosphere? Is that at its most fundamental basic level?
Absolutely.
The whole point of this satellite?
So there's no need. So we know that almost all the emissions that are occurring from the production of oil and gas don't have to happen. The technology exists. It can be the emissions can be reduced cost effectively in almost all cases.
And again, we're not talking about the burning of fossil fuels as a result of the end user. We're talking about the production of the gas.
And the transport. Most of it's occurring at the production end, so it's what we refer to as upstream. And that actually, the emissions are large enough right now that if you were to, as I do, I have a natural gas boiler in my basement, and if I'm burning that natural gas, the impact on the climate over the next 20 years of my doing that, half of it roughly comes from the methane loss before I ever burn it, and half from the CO2 that's being emitted.
Stephen, what do you think in terms of the general public, if they knew that is happening like in their own homes, how it might change their activity and their actions?
Well, I think the key is to give them options and to make sure that the suppliers of the gas are held accountable, because you don't, it's absolutely clear. There's a wide difference in these associated emissions, and there's nobody producing oil and gas who has to create these emissions. This is, the technology exists. This is why this is not even low-hanging fruit, this is fruit on the ground.
Why haven't they done something? You know, this always blows my mind of like doing the right thing, right? They've got to know that they're emitting this into the air.
Well, actually, when we
do they not?
Well, that's the point, is when we started this work, so when I started working on this 14 years ago, the companies actually did not know. And as we collected data on the ground, not with satellites, there were surprises at every corner. And even today, most of the oil and gas companies have a very incomplete understanding of how much they're being emitted. So the key is to provide high quality data. We do not have enough high quality data about greenhouse gas emissions across the board.
Is it just the oil and gas companies, or are we seeing methane as a byproduct when it comes to the decomposition of trash at landfills?
Absolutely. So we have to think about all of the sources of methane. We focused on oil and gas first because, of course, it is economically so easy to do. I mean, it's literally no net cost. It's just got to get action. But we have to worry about waste. And also agriculture is a very large source, of which cows, enteric fermentation, waste from animals, also rice production. But again, there are tools we can use. It's more complicated because we're talking about many more actors and we're talking about a more complex system. But we are working. New Zealand, who's a partner in the New Zealand Space Agency, they have a whole program to collect data from MethaneSat on agriculture around the world, and will again build that picture so we can start to get some better action.
You mentioned that as a partnership. What are the partnerships that you already have, like in the works, or that you anticipate are going to be coming in the future that will really kind of magnify the impact of this?
So we have partnerships with the UN Environment Program, the International Methane Emissions Observatory. We have partnerships, as I said, with New Zealand space agencies. We're partnering with philanthropic groups, right? So the Bezos Earth Fund has been an integral part of the funding that to make this possible, because we want to be able to provide this free. We also have partnerships that allow us to get that data out into many people's hands.
Stephen, as I mentioned, this was a really big deal when the satellite launched back in March. One of the reasons it was is because it has a complex set of instruments that allow it to see what no other satellite has been able to see before. Talk about the tech on board here. Like, what gives you the power to be able to see this from space?
Well, the real advantage of being here in the United States, because we're taking advantage of technologies that are at the very cutting edge. So it's ITAR protected, right? We have all kinds of controls as appropriately. And so we can provide a sensitivity, so we can see very, very small differences in concentration with these very highly specialized detectors. And then the kind of technology we have and the ability to put it together, we work with Ball Aerospace, now BAE, with really the leading instrument maker probably in the world. They built the Hubble telescope, the Webb telescope, and really bringing that kind of level of technology, and working with colleagues at Harvard University and also at Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. So we just got a lot of really smart people leaning in with the world's best technology, so that we're able to really take the technology a major step forward.
So when do we start to see lots of data?
Well, lots of data will be the beginning of next year, but we'll start seeing data before. We'll actually be we have an aircraft version, and we will, at the end of the month, be actually releasing a comparison of oil and gas methane emissions across the United States that we collected from the air with a very comparable instrument. And then we will be releasing data, because one of the things we have to make sure is that we really are confident that the data is solid and that it's fully validated, calibrated. So we're taking our time because we need to make sure we get it right.
How do you do that? How do you make sure? Because you know there'll be naysayers and probably people challenging you, and we do want to make sure we get it right. So how do you make sure that the information that's collected is accurate?
So of course, and we want people to challenge us, because we need to we're doing something new. You want to make sure you get it right, as you said. So what do? There are sensors around the world that actually look up and give you data, and you compare what you're seeing down to what's going up. We also have data that we've collected in other means from places, so we compare our results to those. And we also ask, because we have to do a lot of modeling to get the final result. There's the last step. So we already have teams outside of our team taking the data and modeling, and then we compare the results. We're right now literally in the middle of a benchmarking study, working with funding from the National Science Foundation to collect very intensive data with aircraft and with the satellite, so that we can then create basically a laboratory in which people can analyze it, and we can see how it varies and really learn from each other.
So if all goes according to plan, what's the conversation that we're having 10 years from now? Are we talking about a decline in the methane emissions that have been released as a result of the imaging technology that you developed?
Why go 10 years?
I was going to say, go 5.
4. In 2 years from now, we will have so much more data than, well, basically we've collected more data in the next 2 years than we've ever collected before. We will have, it's like we're going to put on a sharp pair of really high quality glasses, and greenhouse gas emissions across oil and gas will come into focus in a way we've never had. We need to replicate that across methane sources and other greenhouse gases.
But are those oil companies going to just respond by capping their methane emissions?
Of course not. That's why it's not just me, it's the whole data to action pipeline.
Right.
It has to be about bringing the many actors, whether those are financial institutions, governments, investors, policymakers. Collectively, I'm confident, because you're already seeing the industry. They're not high. They're making commitments. At the Conference of the Parties last December, 52 companies, mainly national oil companies, all committed to minimizing their oil and gas emissions. They got ahead of it because they realized this is going to affect them. Well, now we will have the data to see, great, congratulate them, they're doing the job, or saying, in fact, you haven't met your commitments.
Just got about 30 seconds left here. So what's still challenging, though, in this mission?
Well, I think the challenging is to provide these kinds of high-quality data for the first time and make sure they're really of that quality. That's challenging the team, but everybody's committed. This is a team effort. We have people from commercial sector, we have people from academia, we have people from government, all leaning in to produce the best, highest quality data and provide the very first a sector-wide greenhouse gas emissions profile with empirical data for the first time, we'll actually know what's happening.
Okay, be honest. Did any part of you want to ride with that rocket, with that satellite?
I get motion sickness.
So no, okay.
That's a no. That's a
It's
no.
an absolute no.
Listen, it's one of those things that you need all of like public, private, everybody
Absolutely.
kind of in the game, if you will. Stephen, thank you so much. Look forward to, as the data starts to come out, the next few months sound like they're crucial.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Stephen Embark, Senior Vice President, Chief Scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund right here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle.
Hey, we got much more coming up in just a few minutes. We're going to check in with Jason Kelly, fresh off that panel with Jim Coulter. This is...
It's 421 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ both declined today. The big story, though, the Russell 2000, best day of the year today, up 3.6%. This while the S&P fell 49 points, down 0.9%. NASDAQ was down 364 points, down 2%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 2.2%. But again, that Russell 2000 worth repeating, up 3.6%. Bottom line here, S&P 500's longest winning streak since November came to a screeching halt today by the same cohort that has powered the index's year-long rally, and that is mega cap tech. 10-year on the CPI Thursday, 4.20%. The 2-year, 4.51%. Gold up 1.8%, 24.14 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.1%, 82.99 a barrel. Tesla shares among the big decliners today, down 8.4%. Sources tell Bloomberg Tesla is delaying its planned robo-taxi unveiling to October, so teams working on the project can have more time to build additional vehicle prototypes. Again, Tesla down 8.4%. Recapping, 10-year at 4.20%. S&P down 49, down 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Well, President Joe Biden did manage to reassure NATO leaders about his fitness for office with a pretty strong speech at the opening of the alliance's 75th anniversary summit, but it wasn't quite enough to quiet growing doubts about his chance of winning November's U.S. election. So there's been, it sounds like, some side meetings going on, or conversations at least.
Delegations from across Europe were quietly slotting in meetings with advisors and others with links to Donald Trump as they grapple with the possibility, some say likelihood, that he will reclaim the Oval Office. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a controversial member of NATO, is set to meet Trump himself at Mar-a-Lago today after talks with allies in Washington.
And I should point out that President Biden will hold a news conference, expected to do that with the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. That's at 6:30 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg and radio and television. They will be covering it. In the meantime, we want to talk a little bit about the meetings and certainly the position of President Biden. Joining us right now is Bloomberg News U.S. National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams. Joining us from our Washington, D.C. Bureau. Also with us is Hagar Shamali, founder and CEO at Greenwich Media Strategies. Hagar is a former comms director for the U.S. mission to the UN under President Obama and an official of the U.S. Department of the Treasury and National Security Council as well. Great two-step to talk about this. Nick, I want to start with you. Kind of walk us through some of the news today around the summit and some of these meetings that we're hearing that are kind of happening, it seems, quietly when it comes to what might happen in the U.S. November presidential election.
Well, I mean, that is really the big question on everybody's mind. All eyes are on President Biden. He's got the press conference this evening, as you mentioned, and I think, you know, his campaign and the folks around him really see this as the make or break moment. This is his chance to either quiet a lot of the chorus that's calling for him to step aside, or to just further fuel those doubts. Now, you could argue there's not a lot he could do to fully quiet that, but certainly if he has a press conference and he goes and doesn't commit any major stumbles, that will certainly be a point in his favor. I mean, you know, the administration has really tried to keep the focus on policy. Today they announced another $225 million of weapons and aid for Ukraine. They're going to be sending a Patriots missile battery. You've got a raft of security agreements going on, bilateral agreements between various nations and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who continues to be in town. But really the talk is what's happening behind the scenes. And so far, everything we've heard from various delegations is that the president is looking pretty good. You had Keir Starmer, the new UK Prime Minister, come out and basically give a full-throated endorsement after his bilateral with Joe Biden, saying he thought he looked great. So, you know, there is some substance happening here, but it's really all about the optics around President Biden.
Yeah, Hagar, come on in here and talk a little bit about those optics around President Biden, because it's coming at a time when obviously he's meeting with a lot of very high-level officials from NATO. What's on your mind as this summit continues?
Sure. Well, I'll start with that, if you will. And as Nick said, this is really a topic that's overshadowed the NATO summit. Otherwise, without that, the summit itself would be still quite important. And you're talking about a real heavy focus on Ukraine at a time when there's real genuine concern among the European allies in particular as to what happens to NATO and Ukraine aid and just the alliance in general if Donald Trump wins the election. And so still, this has overshadowed this question of Biden's age and how he looks and appears and talks and walks has overshadowed the conference. And the thing that I've noticed is that lower-level European staffers who are talking to the press say that some of them have been surprised in a decline and in how he walks and talks and such. But if you'll notice, his senior, you know, all the heads of state and foreign ministers and such won't comment in any negative way on in this way. As you noted, Keir Starmer, you know, new UK Prime Minister, instead actually went out and said that he seemed great. And and on one hand, you're not going to see that from Biden's counterpart in Washington at the NATO summit. But on the other part, the thing that to really note here is that these are all leaders who are really quite concerned that Trump might win the election, and they don't want him to. And the reason for that is that they're worried about Trump's views on NATO. Just as a side note, Trump cannot, even if he wins the election, he cannot withdraw from NATO single-handedly. That's a decision that 2/3 of the Senate makes. And even if Republicans gain more seats this November, there are still not enough Republicans who would support that. So I'm not worried about that. But still, having a disfavorable view of NATO or not being helpful to NATO is certainly not constructive when Putin has this war launched in Europe's backyard. You also have the question of Ukraine aid, of course, which Trump has vowed to get rid of. And just generally Trump's view toward the alliance, which back when he was president wasn't so positive or favorable. It certainly didn't move forward. And so that's why you see these senior European officials not wanting to comment heavily on this. They don't want to play into it. The Greek prime minister refused to even comment on it. Others have said that they saw it as this political partisan banter was toxic and they wanted no part of it. And I think that's because they don't want to further anything that could undermine or divide the situation in advance of Biden, for Biden in advance of the election.
It's so fascinating, Nick. I just think if, the debate hadn't happened, we'd be having a very different conversation with you and Hagar about NATO in particular.
This is overshadowing everything.
It really is fascinating.
Obviously, around the issues of Biden's own performance is what specifically he says about Ukraine and its own path toward membership in the alliance. I mean, the communique that has come out of this summit talks about a quote-unquote irreversible path, but really this is something where the U.S. is not eager to make a particular commitment anytime soon. NATO is really divided on this. There are a lot of countries that think Ukraine should come in immediately, and then there are a whole host of countries who think Ukraine should never come in, and that's a terrible idea. So President Zelensky has really pushed for a long time, give me a time-bound, specific, clear rule of the road that will tell me exactly how I'm going to get into NATO. That's what I need, and you give me that, and I'll go do it. And then you have the alliance, on the other hand, coming back and saying, okay, hey, we want to give you membership, but we're not going to really set a timeline, and we're going to set out a set of demands that are kind of not terribly specific, so demands around reforms, anti-corruption reforms, military reforms, and things like that. So to me, to see whether there's any budging from President Biden, of course, in some ways you can argue it may not really matter that much as we all talk about President Trump, former President Trump. I mean, a few months away, if he wins the election, all bets are off, and you can be pretty sure that Ukraine's going to be even farther away from NATO membership. So it'll be interesting to see if President Biden can say anything that will help assure NATO and Ukraine about U.S. intentions beyond November and then Inauguration Day in January.
And can I add on to that,
about,
actually?
American. Oh, please, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to add on to Nick's point. That's also why you're seeing this effort to kind of quote Trump-proof things in case Trump does win the election. And so, for example, when they're talking about Ukrainian membership, they're using the word irreversible. They want to set Ukraine on this, quote, irreversible path to membership. And now, again, that membership is not going to happen while Ukraine is in war. They're focusing on democratic reforms and so on that Ukraine has to make. But nonetheless, it's hard to know exactly when that would happen. But their use of the word irreversible is meant to try and put it in stone as much as they feasibly can before Trump comes into office. And another thing that I think would be really fascinating to see if Biden talks about today at the press conference is something that's gotten overlooked a little bit, which is that there was a decision made today that long-range intermediary weapons missiles would be placed in Germany. And that sounds like more of the same of what the United States does, but it's not. This is a big deal. Those are the weapons that were that President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev took away in the INF treaty that Trump walked back from in 2019. And Trump walked back from it because Russia wasn't holding up its end of the bargain, which is fair. But that said, that's a significant deal.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Hey, guys, thank you so much. Bloomberg News U.S. National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau, and Hagar Shamali. She's founder and CEO at Greenwich Media Strategies, former comms director, as we mentioned earlier, for the U.S. mission to the UN under President Obama.
Hey, just a reminder that Bloomberg Radio and Television will have live coverage of President Biden's news conference with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg tonight at 6:30 p.m. Wall Street time. So that's set for just 2 hours from now. Was going to be 4:30.
Right.
Was going to be 5:30. Now it's going to be 6:30.
Safe to say, I mean, this is another case because of that debate where President Biden, no doubt about it, struggled. It's going to be about performance again and what he has to say, and maybe not so much about content, although there's a lot going on, certainly, when it comes to our NATO allies.
Well, let's stay in Washington, D.C. now for checking the latest world and national news. We've got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. The chorus of those wanting President Biden to step aside is growing, but Biden is sticking to his pledge to run against Donald Trump. Today, he will have the chance to calm some nerves if he does give a solid performance at his first solo news conference in months. Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she'll be watching.
Listen, we're going to hear from the president today, and people will be able to judge that for themselves.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries admits lawmakers are discussing all options.
Those conversations have been candid, clear-eyed, and comprehensive. And that's important for us to do as a House Democratic Caucus family. And as long as those conversations are ongoing, I'm going to respect the sanctity of those conversations until we conclude that process.
Congressman Jeffries did say that House Democrats are unified on the Biden agenda. Following President Biden's meeting today with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the administration announced a new $225 million security assistance package for Ukraine.
Russia will not prevail in Ukraine. Will not prevail in Ukraine. Ukraine will prevail.
But Zelensky says in order to prevail, the U.S. must lift limits on using its weapons to strike military targets inside Russia. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says negotiators have made progress in ceasefire talks in the Israel-Hamas conflict, but he admits there are still miles to go before they'll be close to a deal. He says signs are more positive, though, than they've been in months. Actress Shelley Duvall has died. The wide-eyed actress was 75. She co-starred in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Her partner, Dan Gilroy, announced Duvall died in her sleep today at her home in Texas. Global News, 24 hours a day. I'm Nancy Lyons.
4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Turned out to be a mixed Thursday. The Dow higher, the S&P, NASDAQ, they both declined. The big story, though, Russell 2000 surging today by 3.6%. Best day of the year for the Russell 2000. S&P today down 49, ending the day at 55.84, a drop of 0.9%. The Dow up 32, up 0.1%. NASDAQ down by 2%. The S&P 500's longest winning streak since November was stopped today by the same cohort that has powered the index's year-long rally, and that is mega cap tech. Investors were bailing out of the so-called Mag 7 stocks: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta Platforms, and Tesla by the most in nearly a year, as inflation data sparked bets that the Fed will be cutting rates as soon as September. We've got the 10-year at 4.20%, the 2-year 4.51%, gold up 1.8%, 24.14 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up by 1%, 82.96 a barrel. The focus now on earnings. Melissa Otto is TMT analyst at S&P Global Visible Alpha.
Coming into this earnings season, companies, particularly in the tech sector, that have performed very well in the first half, who've seen their valuations start to look either fully valued or a little bit stretched, are going to have to beat expectations, not just in the quarter, but in terms of their guidance, in order to maintain the momentum in their stock prices. If they don't, there may be some volatility ahead.
Indeed. Melissa Otto of S&P Global Visible Alpha. Next up, bank earnings tomorrow morning. Yes, complete coverage on Bloomberg Radio. In specific, we'll be hearing from JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. It was a mixed day for the three of them. JP Morgan Chase down 0.2%. Citigroup tumbled 1.9%. Wells Fargo up by 0.7%. Again, bank earnings front and center ahead of the open tomorrow morning on Bloomberg Radio. Recapping, big day for the Russell 2000, up 3.6%. Money coming out of techs. We had NASDAQ down 2%, S&P down by 0.9%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, everybody, we kicked off today earlier. I was a little busy. I was backstage because I ran into this dude, Bloomberg Originals chief correspondent Jason Kelly, also my former co-host here on Bloomberg Business Week. You had an interesting conversation with Jim Coulter of TPG today.
Yeah, it was great to catch up with him. I mean, this is a guy I've known for a long time, and one of his signature moves is he does these incredible deep dives into whatever he's doing. Maybe it's the global economy when he was running TPG, the firm which he obviously
PowerPoint, doesn't he?
Oh, he loves it. He's got it going on. He has gone all in on climate, which is obviously why he's here. Billions of dollars raised. He's out raising 2 new funds right now, in fact. So he walked this crowd through sort of what's kind of going on in his mind, made some really interesting comparisons.
Yeah, there was a great moment where he talked about the journey of basically a carbon-based fuel.
Yes. I have to say, so this is the first time I've interviewed a lot of private equity executives in front of a lot of crowds. At no time has a private equity investor ever inspired spontaneous applause from a crowd, and he did, because he was talking about, I can't even do it justice, the difference between creating essentially an electron using fossil fuels versus the sun, and it was incredible.
Yeah, because we talk about, the challenge of shifting to renewables, but when he presented it like that and talked about the journey of carbon into gas, the refining process, and then the electrical generation process versus just taking the sun and transferring that to electricity, he made it sound like it was so easy.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because that was really, I think, at the core of his entire message to this crowd, which, as you guys, I'm sure, have talked about, is a fascinating crowd that's gathered here because it is like classic Bloomberg people mixed with activists and entrepreneurs and, folks who really just want to make a difference in the world. And again, for someone coming from sort of a Wall Street background to basically be like, hey, guys, we can do this. Like, let's do it. And here, and essentially, like, I've got the money. Let's go. Like, let's get to work. Let's not listen to the whatabouters and like start doing it.
Jason, that's what I was thinking about. You've been talking to Jim for a long time, as you said, and I wonder if the conversation about the technology in terms of addressing climate change, has it gotten easier? Is there more interest? Like, how has it changed?
Well, it has changed in part because people like Jim, people like Al Gore and David Blood over at Generation. I mean, they're making money doing this.
Right.
I mean,
it comes down to, right?
I'll quote a Carol Masterism here. We're Bloomberg, which you often tee up when you're asking a question. And it's ultimately about the markets. It's about capital availability. You know, this is the feedstock of this new revolution is money.
This is private equity we're talking about.
Yes.
I mean, this is like ruthless dollars traditionally. You wrote a book about private equity.
Yeah.
This is typically how this
Two
works.
books.
Yeah.
Two books about private equity? All right, I gotta
Sweat
add,
Equity is the second book.
All right, I gotta add that to my.
Come on, Tim.
Okay.
Download that on your Kindle.
Yeah, I will for the flight home. But what is the opportunity that he sees? Because the challenge, and we talked about this with Alaska Airlines Chief Sustainability Officer. Yeah, you can use sustainable aviation fuel, but it's going to cost you 4 times as much as conventional fuel.
So I think it's picking your spots, obviously, and figuring out where there is a transition happening where either new products need to be made, new services need to be made, new materials need to be discovered. This is a global issue. You know, Jim talks about it. I think you heard him say it's a $150 trillion opportunity. I mean, it's a lot of money. You do have to marshal the right resources. You have to have the right ideas. You have to be willing to fail. You have to, you know, sort of create this new, dare I say, ecosystem. But money has to be a part of that. And people need to realize some profits, and then they plow them back in, and we do it all over again.
All right, so you've got another panel coming up with a couple of athletes. Having said that, I feel like you are our sports king, our sports guru, if I can call you that. A new season of Power Players.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Really exciting. Kicked off this week with none other than Cal Ripken Jr., the Iron Man. You know, probably one of the 10 best athletes in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
You know, a truly iconic human being, you know, holds the record, which, you know, not many records are unbreakable. His streak of consecutive games played, I think, will live forever.
Really?
Almost without question in baseball. I mean, there's no one who's within like 1,500 games of him at this point. He did it in the mid-90s. What he's doing now, which is the reason we caught up with him, is he's going all in on youth sports. So I visited him.
He grew up in sports, right? So like passing the baton.
Absolutely. And he, you know, his father, Cal Ripken Sr., very notably devoted a lot of his time to youth baseball. Interestingly enough, the big move, it all comes back to private equity, guys. Cal has partnered with Josh Harris and David Blitzer, and they're building this company called Unrivaled Sports, which is not just doing diamond sports like baseball and softball, but rectangle sports as well. So lacrosse, flag football, they're even getting into the outdoor space as well.
Younger generation.
Yes.
Well, what's the opportunity, though, that he sees with youth sports? I mean, is it one about this is the right thing for kids to be doing, or is this a business opportunity?
Yes and yes. I mean, I think you talk to anyone, and I think both of you fall into this category. We all played sports as a kid. You were very serious gymnast, if I remember. Sports helps in so many assets and aspects of life. You know, I see it with my kids who are athletes. It's a great way to learn, to be on a team, to win and lose, to be coachable, to get feedback, all these different things. Also, parents are willing to pay a lot of money for it. And so there's a big business opportunity as well. You know, one of the key questions that came up that clearly they have to address is accessibility. You know, there are a lot of people who are willing to spend a lot of money, but there needs to be more opportunity for people who might not be able to afford those really high price tags. That's very front of mind, I know, for Cal and for Josh and Dave as well.
Nice guy.
I mean, everything you'd want him to be.
Like, right?
Everything you want him to be. Like, sort of rolls up to the interview, drove himself, you know, popped in, introduced himself. I'm Cal. It's like, yep.
Yeah, we know.
Yep, I'm familiar. I'm familiar with you. So, you know, it doesn't always work out that way, but he's a really, really top-tier human being.
All right, Power Players airing Mondays at 6 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Television and at 8 p.m. on Bloomberg Original Stream. You can also catch it on demand via Bloomberg.com and YouTube.
It's everywhere.
Let's try that again. YouTube.
Can you give us 5 seconds on who else you have coming up on Power Players?
Masai Ujiri talking about basketball in Africa. Shad Khan, the owner of Jacksonville Jaguars and Fulham FC, and Jessica Berman, commissioner of National Women's Soccer League.
All right.
The sports king.
Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Tesla shares today down 8.4%. Sources tell Bloomberg Tesla is delaying its planned robo-taxi unveiling to October to allow teams working on the project more time to build additional vehicle prototypes. CEO Elon Musk set the initial August 8th date for the event months ago. That optimism about the spectacle has contributed to an 11-day streak of gains that had added more than $257 billion to Tesla's market cap. Bloomberg News says the postponement has been communicated internally, and the car maker will now show the vehicle in October. Tesla today down 8.4%. Big banks report tomorrow. We'll be hearing from J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. Bank stocks, for the most part, lower today after the CPI report. Erica Najarian covers big banks for UBS Securities.
Keep in mind that the money centers were huge outperformers so far this year, massively outperforming the mid-cap bank index or the carry. And so I think the setup today is, oh gosh, September is live. Not only is it live, there's an 88% chance that we're going to get our first cut sooner rather than later. And so this is a bit of a reversal of the trade. Everybody was hiding in the money center banks in terms of higher for longer. And now, given especially the valuation, and if you pair that with, the coming elections, I think you're really starting to see that trade reverse and regional banks get a bid.
Erica Najarian of UBS. J.P. Morgan Chase down today by 0.2%. Citigroup down 1.9%. Wells Fargo today was up by 0.7%. All of those names reporting tomorrow ahead of the opening bell. Again, recapping here, down day for the S&P, down 0.9. I'm Charlie Pellet. Those are our company stories. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. We're live here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle, Washington. Let's go to Washington, D.C. now for a check on the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Nance.
President Biden's campaign officials met today with Senate Democrats, hoping to ease their concerns over the president's ability to serve if elected in November. Biden's solo news conference, scheduled for this evening, could shift the debate one way or the other. Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan says she's sticking by the president and supports his reelection run.
I look at this and I see flawless execution from this administration. COVID relief, infrastructure dollars, not just bills that have gotten passed, but things that are being executed flawlessly, like the CHIPS Act, which is so important to our Michigan manufacturing economy, something that President Biden has championed.
Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens will appear with Biden in Michigan tomorrow as the president returns to the campaign trail. The protracted heat wave in the West is raising the risk of wildfires. California's top fire official says so far this year, the state has responded to more than 3,500 wildfires that have scorched nearly 325 square miles of vegetation. Well, power is still out in parts of Houston where Hurricane Beryl came ashore Monday. Houston Mayor John Whitmire says they're needing help to manage traffic since many of the traffic lights are out.
On their way to Houston right now are over 100 officers from our major cities and around the state of Texas. They will be here to work with HPD in our communities that are dark from lack of electricity.
Whitmire says over 1 million people are still without power. During testimony today at Alec Baldwin's involuntary manslaughter trial, a crime scene tech says she found live rounds of ammunition all over the Rust movie set after the cinematographer was killed. She says the prop truck was so disorganized, many of the boxes of real and dummy ammunition looked alike. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg. Now back to you, Carol and Tim.
Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. Nancy Lyons there in D.C. All right, folks, we are getting ready to wrap up here in Seattle at the Bloomberg Green Festival. Pretty busy. There's lots more events to come. They've got, I think, another day or so of events and activities. Yeah, going into Saturday. Yeah, some excursions.
We're only invited for a couple days. It's okay. We'll be back in New York City tomorrow, bringing you our show live starting at 2 Wall Street time.
I gotta say, check out Bloomberg.com. Tim and I are looking at the NI Green function. A bunch of stories. We just had Jason Kelly on and his conversation with Jim Coulter of TPG. Jim Coulter talking about climate investing being a little bit more challenging than expected. He should know. He's been doing this for years, and he's got some money to invest, but nonetheless, not always so easy.
And then a headline from your own panel a little earlier, Carol, Amazon Sustainability Chief, who spoke earlier today with you, said that we have to act now when it comes to the climate. We're talking about Kara Hurst, who said that companies need to commit to cutting carbon, even if the plan on how to do it isn't clear yet.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon created the Climate Pledge a few years ago, and they've got hundreds of companies that have signed on to it when it comes to reducing their carbon emissions and eliminating them by 2040. But we need more to certainly sign up. And you think about Amazon, other technology companies. We talk about AI, data centers. You think about the energy needs and what kind of stress that will put on the system. So another facet to certainly that conversation.
Earlier today, before you took to the stage, Stacey Abrams was up there, and she said that she supports President Joe Biden as the Democratic presidential nominee, and she's working to help him get reelected. She said this in a panel here at the Bloomberg Green Festival.
Yeah, and then you had Sally Jewell also talking about what could happen in the November elections and what maybe a President Trump would mean when it comes to the climate, and she sees some of the gains that have been made, maybe that unraveling.
Well,
so
Gina McCarthy also
speaking
about that to us as well.
If you missed any of it, check out the conversations. You can find them online and at Bloomberg.com. Fun couple of days.
Yeah, really fun couple of days. A big thank you to the crew here on site at the Bloomberg Green Festival. Thank you guys all so much for making the show run smoothly. And of course, also the folks back in New York City who do such a good job making us sound and look good.
I hate to say, but we're actually going to get